Fred Russell, an autobiography, transcribed from the author's private manuscripts and as dictated to his daughter, Elaine Thatcher, Arizona, 1990. Preface. This story was written in the first person as lived and seen through the eyes of the sixth child, Fred Russell, of the Henry Utilise Russell and Harriet Louisa Brewer Russell family, who settled in the Gila Valley, Graham County, territory of Arizona in 1900. Although facts in the narrative are largely drawn from the memory of the narrator, I acknowledge and extend my sincere thanks for the valuable assistance that my daughter Elaine has given me in organizing and compiling this story. I am especially indebted to Utilise, my next eldest brother, with whom I lived and with whom I was happy to share the most intimate thoughts and experiences during our early life in Graham County. I am also indebted to Utilise and his lovely wife Cleo for their masterful work in their life as our family genealogist in compiling an interesting and informative story of my father's family back to our early ancestor, John Russell, a glazier which was our earliest ancestor to arrive in America. He landed in Boston on March 3, 1635, and also in researching and compiling a history of my mother's family back to our emigrant ancestor Thomas Brewer, who, with his two brothers, arrived from England to settle on the Connecticut River in the year 1682. He settled and took up land, and with the aid of his son, Daniel, also father of our family line, developed one of the finest plantations in the area of that time. His son Daniel served in the French and Indian Wars prior to the American Revolution. My father, Henry Utilise Russell, born March 30th, 1863, at Fillmore, Utah, married my mother, Harriet Louisa Brewer, who was born March 13th, 1872, at Big Cottonwood, Utah, on March 7th, 1887. My father had been called in 1898 by the Mormon Church to serve a 2-year mission in the Kansas vineyards, recruiting saints for the new gospel. My mother and her brood of 5 children lived with her father's family, Grandpa Jacob Brewer, and her 9 brothers and 1 sister who had migrated from their old home in Pinedale, northern Arizona, to the Gila Valley in search of what they had been told was a land of perpetual spring and summer. Grandpa had filed a homestead claim on the Stockton Wash, south of Safford, with his family, and lived under a brush arbor they had constructed for a temporary shelter while they were occupied with collecting materials for a new house and eking out a subsistence in this wilderness area. My father's mission temporarily fulfilled, he returned to his family sometime in the late fall of 1900. He acquired a team and wagon, filed a homestead claim, and constructed a tent house on his new claim in the foothills at the base of majestic Mount Graham, 4th highest mountain in the Arizona Territory. His tent house was approximately 4 miles west of Grandpa's claim. In Grandpa's day, he had progressed from handcart to ox cart, and in his late 50s, stood poised on the threshold of a new age, that of horsepower, of which he still remained a bit skeptical, while Pa, who had progressed from ox power to horsepower, was a great enthusiast for the new fast age. In his evangelistic duties, he had, however, been living in the Lord's day, each consisting of 1,000 years, in which the rhythm of time had no essence and calamity did not exist. As time marched on, Harriet, my mother, conceived and grew heavy with child. Where Pa was at this time, I do not know, but as typical of his behavior in subsequent emergencies, he was most likely somewhere out in left field looking after his evangelistic duties. In his mind, time was of no importance and a crisis was of little consequence. Pa was content to pursue his church duties without thought of his family. See Ernest Russell's biography of Henry Utilise Russell, which includes an account of Fred's birth, for a different perspective. Born under a skeet bush, as day broke, on the 8th day of September, 1901, Mother set out for Grandmother Brewer's place to seek aid and comfort. Leaving my 3-year-old brother, Utilise Leroy, she grasped the hand of my 8-year-old sister, Edna Ann. They followed a cow trail through the thickets of heavy brush, stopping occasionally to avoid the stabbing pain from the brush of a thorny mesquite limb. As the sun began to rise, they had progressed to a thicket on the sunny side of Sugarloaf Hill, about 3½ miles from home and a ½ mile from Grandma's place. The call of a quail, the faint odor of a skunk, recently disturbed by the inquisitive snout of a javelina hog, the parting of the red curtains of mist in the eastern sky, permitting a sunbeam to escape and dance for a moment on the hillside, made her aware of the stir of life's awakening to a new morning. She paused in the thicket for a moment, looking for an opening in the thorny branches of the mesquite above, and felt a sudden stab of excruciating pain as a harbinger of the stir of life within her body. Then suddenly something pushed the panic button, and she pushed my little sister forward with a frantic cry, "Go get Grandma!" Presto, there I was, stark naked in a wilderness inhabited with scorpions, Gila monsters, and rattlesnakes, under a skeet bush. There was no other shelter nearby. This was known as the Robinson Place. It was here that I, Fred Russell, was born. A new Caruso, I presume. At any rate, I seem to have been one ever since. But the Lord blesses each hardship with some compensation. No doctor bills. No revenuer to tax the shirt off one's back. Of course I had none. Eventually, grandmother arrived, and after a few minutes in her capable hands, the crisis was past, and the sun again shone on a new and happy day. The area of my birth had not been christened and can only be described as brush and wilderness country, located about 7 miles south of the Gila River, and a little Mexican village known as Safford. Recently expanded by the influx of a few Mormon families who had migrated from southern Utah in search of what they had been told, was a land with an ideal climate. This large southern section of the Arizona-New Mexico territory, reaching from the Gila River southward to the present Mexican border, had been acquired by the United States, resulting from the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico in 1853. American cavalry outposts stationed along lines of travel and communication had secured the new territory from attacks of Indians and outlaws and enabled cattle ranching and mining ventures to get started. A branch line of the Southern Pacific had just been completed, extending from Fort Bowie through Safford to Globe. Another branch was being constructed to serve the mining camp at Clifton. Other military outposts extended along lines of communication were Forts Grant, Thomas, and Geronimo. The village of Safford, named after an early governor of the territory, was favorably located in a fertile valley between Fort Bowie and Globe, contributed crops of grain, fruits, and vegetables, which had been, prior to the railroads, transported by wagon caravans. In the year 1901, William McKinley was president. On September 6th, 2 days before my birth on the 8th, McKinley was shot by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, at the Pan American Exposition at Buffalo, New York. He died 4 days after I was born. His administration was distinguished by victory in the Spanish-American War, the annexation of Hawaii, and the acquisition of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. In the United States, he was responsible for the Homestead Act of 1902. This act made it possible for my father to obtain land free by filing a homestead claim. Most of the land was at this time densely covered with heavy mesquite, cactus, and creosote brush, which had to be cleared to make way for useful planting. This immediate area of my birth, later called Cactus Flat, was made up of bench land, small valleys and flat-top hills, benching up to the foot of a great granite outcrop of the Pinaleno Range, towering from a base altitude of about 4,000 feet to its crest of nearby 11,000-foot Mount Graham. This great mountain, densely forested with oak, juniper, yellow pine, spruce, and aspen, acts as a wind barrier and watershed. Although an arid region, it furnishes runoff for both surface and an artesian belt where flowing water can be brought to the surface by drilling wells about 450 feet deep. The fauna of this region includes coyotes, foxes, bobcats, bear, mountain lions, deer, turkeys, rabbits, squirrels, quail, snakes, Gila monsters, and javelina hogs. Under the National Homestead Act of that time, land could be taken up and patent obtained by filing a homestead claim, building a home, clearing and planting some of the land, and adding other improvements. After living on it for a stipulated time, a clear title to the land and all it contained, water, timber, and mineral rights would be granted by the U.S. government. Congressmen even sent packets of garden seed to assist and encourage the new homeowner. Dominant characters. For the possible interest to descendants of this family, a descriptive sketch of the dominant characters is being attempted. Grandpa Jacob Brewer, born June 21, 1833, at Neversink, Sullivan County, New York, before being bent over by agonizing pain of rheumatism and premature aging from hard work, was about 6 feet tall, fair-skinned, but deeply tanned by exposure, with heavy full-bearded face, blue-gray eyes, brown hair, bald crest, soft-spoken with Old English inflection and word usage. He was one humbled by poverty, religious in nature, but undemonstrative with low profile, patient, charitable, and understanding without show of emotion. In his late 60s, he walked only with the support of a cane, and sometimes only with crutches. A lover of God and his creations, a hewer of wood, and a master craftsman of anything he wished to make of materials at hand. His wife, Grandma Sabra Ann Follett Brewer, born September 15, 1847, at Steuben County, New York, a most perfect mate for a pioneer husband, a selfless, patient, and devoted supporter of her spouse and their family, a brave, religious, but quiet person who extended her services and healing skills to all in need in her community without thought of compensation. A pioneer woman, toughened by the hardship of poverty, made stubborn by adversity, humbled and softened by sorrow. She was a strong mainspring in family affairs, an expert homemaker and gardener whose efforts safeguarded her family from the pangs of hunger. Jacob Albert Brewer, born June 15, 1865, oldest child, physically a giant in stature, standing 6 feet 3 inches of bone and muscle, weighing 250 pounds. When he braced his strength, something had to give, be it ox, wagon, or newly fallen tree, quiet, patient, and modest by nature, rugged gut, trim in stature, unassuming, charitable, and benevolent. He was a strict servant of the codes of his conscience, a slave to duty, and a bachelor who never married. Adam Rufus Brewer, born February 21, 1874, physically appear in height to his brother Albert, but in stature was in the medium-heavy class, strengthened by pioneer adversities. He had magnificent mental and physical control of both body and character. He was religious and devoted to his creed and his duties as he saw them, patient, unassuming, and humble, but gifted in wisdom and common sense. He served a 2-year church mission in Florida, married Miss Rosina Pomeroy of a pioneer family in Mesa on his return from his mission. Harriet Louisa Brewer, Russell, my mother, a beautiful woman of medium height, trim in stature, with kind blue eyes. She had fair skin and honey hair. Her dominant traits were, number 1, supreme patience. She was understanding, tolerant, but persevering in pursuit of what to her was life's highest goals. She was industrious, courageous, and tenacious. She was gifted with wisdom and good common sense. She possessed the enthusiasm to pursue the jewels in the crown of achievement, which to her were the most precious. She believed the key to this treasure was to get a good education, an accomplishment neither she nor any of her family in those frontier days had an opportunity to obtain. Her enthusiasm in the achievement of this goal was so intense it became contagious. The infection spread to more or less dominate the lives of her children. Alice May Brewer, mother's sister. Alice, being the youngest child of the Jacob Brewer family, was humored by her mother to the point of being quite badly spoiled. She did not take well to bearing responsibilities and neglected to do her share of the homework to relieve her mother of the heavy workload she carried. Alice became extremely overweight and, of course, missed the admiration of the opposite sex. To this, she became highly sensitive. To abridge this gap in life's motivation, she turned her thoughts and energy to learning some of the fine arts. She learned by self-help to become an exceptionally good reader and enjoyed reading both silently and aloud to others. For this skill, she immediately became popular with children. Her selection of reading material included the best literature and stories she could obtain. Life of Abraham Lincoln, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Robinson Crusoe, Girl of the Limberlost, Robin Hood and His Merry Outlaws, Swiss Family Robinson, and some of Sir Walter Scott's dramatic novels. She also became quite proficient in music. She had a very good singing voice and understood music to the extent she could carry the tune in both alto and soprano. She mastered the skill of playing the guitar and organ and played for church services and dancing, the principal entertainment for young folks in our community. Aunt Alice lived with her parents until grandmother passed away. Then she lived in mother's household. She never married. How the world was. Children were born and lived without doctors or their medicines. They married and were encouraged to build their own homes and support their families without government assistance. There were no newspapers to convince them they were poor. They knew that and worked hard to improve their condition. What they earned was theirs to keep. There were no taxes except those they levied upon themselves to build schools and educate their children. There were no professional agitators to pit one group against another to convince them they belonged to a minority and were entitled privileges. No hunting licenses or permits to support bureaucrats. No union cards to support labor bosses. No permits required to camp where one liked or to cut down a few trees to build a cabin if one wished to stay for a while. People died, sure, but had no doctor or undertaker bills to pay that would cost their life savings. When wars were declared, it was planned to win. Winner take all. When new land was conquered, the conquering government kept it. They did not give it back to the enemy and pay them to take it back. When land was purchased, they planned to keep this also, not give it back, and pay millions in indemnity, as they are now doing with the Panama Canal. It was true there was considerable skullduggery going on in high places. Great land grants were made to the railroad builders to encourage them to build their roads. Big concessions were made to oil developers, steamship lines, and manufacturers. These government handouts made millionaires of private investors, but netted in overall prosperity for the country and its people. Money was scarce and hard to come by, but the buying power of $1 at that time was equal to a $20 bill of today. No paper was circulated as money. Copper, nickel, and silver coins were used in the lower exchange, including the silver dollar, while gold was used for all exchanges above the dollar. Settlement of Lebanon cactus. Approximately 50 Mormon families migrated from southern Utah and settled in this area between 1890 to 1910. Most of them filed on homesteads and developed artesian wells. My father came in 1900 and took up his claim in the foothills of Mount Graham. He cleared some land, put a tent house and drilled a small artesian well, planted a garden, and incidentally located a site for a small pond to catch mountain runoff to supplement his well water. Sometime after the second year, the well sanded off and went dry. Having no assets to clean the well or drill another, he tried to develop the mountain flow, but his efforts met with little success. Being a dry year, there was little runoff. He then began looking for other possibilities as he had already used his homestead filing right. He located a tract set aside for school support, called school land, under the control of the territory. This could be leased for a small yearly rental but could not be bought or homesteaded. To recoup his cash assets, he took a job in Clifton, laying brick for the Shannon smelter being constructed at that time. He moved his family to a small place in Pima, a small village 9 miles downriver from Safford, where the older children could attend school. After about a year's work in Clifton, Father returned to the school land located on the Stockton Wash, about 3 miles east of the homestead he had abandoned. He paid the year's lease, cleared some ground, and arranged for drilling an artesian well. This was about 1904. On April 4th, 1904, my little sister Ina was born. It was about this time that the film of my first memory, pictures of life, recorded pictures of small incidents that occurred, such as memory of a small orchard with trees loaded with delicious peaches, apricots, plums, and almonds. I remember how good those fruits tasted and of drinking cold water from a running stream that ran through the orchard. I remember Tylas, my older brother, and Wilford Brewer, my cousin, made some stilts and walked on them around the yard. The stilts raised them high enough to step over a barbed wire fence without touching the top wire. I watched them do these things with some envy. Being unable to walk on the stilts, I tried fence straddling myself. Needless to say, my legs were a little short, so I compromised by using the stretched barbed strands as ladder steps until I reached the top strand, where I got hooked near the top button of my blouse. I tried to get loose but couldn't. I saw no one around to help. Finally, I became tired and sleepy. The next thing I knew, I was in my mother's arms. She had discovered me hooked on the fence with my head hanging back as if I were dead. Another early childhood memory picture that impressed me: the Southern Pacific Bowie Globe branch line, which had recently been completed, ran on the border of this small place. We heard the whistle and clatter of the freight train each time it passed. As the line ran through the San Carlos Apache Reservation between Pima and Globe, Any Indians wishing to come to town were allowed to ride free. This resulted in considerable movement of the Indian population for the first few years, until the new wore off. Most of the cars were loaded with Indian squaws dressed in long, full-ruffled dresses, wearing buckskin high-top moccasins, decorated with colored beadwork and turned-up pointed toes. I was told by my father to stay away from these squaws, as they all carried big sharp knives in the leggings of their moccasins, and they especially liked little towheads like me. I gave them a wide berth, but liked to watch them from a safe distance. Another early memory picture. When we expected the train to be coming soon, we sometimes placed pins or nails on the track, and when the heavy engine had run over them, we found them flattened like little knives. And if cross pins were placed, they were often welded together as little scissors. My father worked quite steadily with the improvements on the new school land location. He drilled another well, made a pond, and planted cottonwood shade trees around it. He acquired an old frame house and moved it on the place for temporary shelter, set out a few apple and peach trees, and after the pond had filled from the new well, he planted black bass fish in it. My elder brothers had grown old enough to be of considerable help to him by this time. Frank was about 18, Ernest 16, Tillis about 7, and Edna, who helped mother a great deal, was about 12. Building our home, we moved out to our new home about 1905. Soon after we became settled, I had an accident. I stepped on a rusty nail which resulted in blood poison. As there was no professional help, no effective treatment was given. High fever set in, resulting in convulsions and spasms. I lay at the point of death for several days. I distinctly remember the sensation of going in and coming out of coma. My mother and Grandma Brewer did everything they could possibly do to save me, and finally their prayers and medication prevailed. The big painful lump, which had formed in my groin, eased off some. My fever finally subsided, the pain receded, and after a few more days I was on my feet again, attending the 4th of July celebration about a half-mile east of Father's homestead, a place that was later called Lebanon. This building was made of adobe, mixed, molded, and dried on the building site. The dimensions were about 20 feet by 30 feet, single room with a pitched shingle roof. It served primarily as the church, but was also used for amusements, school, and all other social activities of the community. This 4th of July celebration must have been in 1905. We had foot races, ball games, tug of war, sack races, along with ice cream, candy, peanuts, and popcorn. I remember the pain and swelling from my poisoned leg had about all cleared, but had localized in a big boil on my right foot, back of my big toe. I believe this was the year the Jennings family took up a homestead adjoining our school land on the north. Chester, Uncle Chet, we called him, his wife Addie, Chester Jr., my age, and Lucy, who said she would be free in August. These children, Tylis and I, grew to become almost inseparable. Our homes were within sight of each other, and we were together most of the time. Uncle Chet was from New York State. He had left his home at an early age and spent about 20 years working on ranches as a cowboy in Colorado before coming to Arizona, where he met Aunt Addie Coons, married her, and settled down beside us. In spirit, he was young at heart, kind, tolerant, and very understanding. Both he and Aunt Addie seemed like second parents to me. My Grandpa Brewer had given my mother a milk cow, old pet, for a wedding present, so in all its moving, our family was never without a cow or two. Tillis learned to milk about this time. As we grew no feed, we depended on the open range for cow feed. It was our job to pen them up at night and let them loose after milking in the mornings. They ranged sometimes as far as 3 miles from home. So about 2 hours before sundown each evening, we were out on the hills listening for cowbells. There was no supper when there was no bread and milk. Under Frank's guidance and help, Tillis and I cobbled up a milk cooler, which consisted of an open frame with 3 shelves mounted on legs. It stood about 4 feet high, covered with burlap, in the shade of a cottonwood tree near the pond bank. A bucket with a small hole punched in the bottom was wired to a limb just above the cooler and did a fair job of keeping the milk cool. The bucket was refilled with water about twice each day. Sometime in July or August, Edna was sent to the cooler to check the milk. Our little sister Ina was just learning to crawl, and unnoticed, she left the house. While Edna was at the milk cooler, she had a sudden impulse of excitement come over her. She left the cooler and ran for the house, and there near the doorsteps, little Ina was reaching out to a coiled rattlesnake that was all ready to strike. In panic, Edna grabbed the child just in time to save her life. My father was occupied most of the time with plans to construct a new adobe house. He, Frank, and Ernest worked on all kinds of jobs to procure lumber, shingles, doors and windows, and hardware for the new house. When not working for others, they prepared for making adobes and gathering rock for the foundation and walls. A pit was dug, straw procured, molds were constructed, and eventually the adobe making job got underway. Mud with the proper mixture of sand and clay was mixed with hose and shovels and tromped until it reached the right texture. Straw was added and mixed thoroughly into the mud. The wooden molds would be soaked and placed on a flat, cleared ground, which had recently been covered with a thin coat of sand and sprinkled with water. The mud mix was bucketed and then poured into the molds. The molds were tamped thoroughly to displace voids and air bubbles, and then sprinkled lightly. The molds would be carefully lifted to prevent distortion. One frame yielded from 4 to 6 adobes, which varied in dimensions to conform to the plan specifications of the wall structure, usually 4 inches by 8 inches by 16 inches. After allowing the newly formed adobes to dry for a couple of days, they were turned on edge to complete the drying process. After about a week, they could be handled, moved, racked, or stored under cover for a month when they could be cured sufficiently to put into the wall. Guidelines were prepared for the foundation trench, usually 10 inches to 12 inches wide and 12 inches to 16 inches deep. Then rock was gathered from the hills, hauled and placed in the trench with a lime cement mortar mix to fill up the voids and bind the rocks. The foundation of rocks is essential to raise the adobe at least 6 inches above the ground, where otherwise it would dissolve, melt, and crack the walls. Adobe making and wall building extended until after the first of 1906. Carpentry floor, roof, windows, and door construction continued through most of the rest of the summer. By fall, the house was not finished, but it had reached a stopping place, and the family moved in to enjoy the luxury of a wood floor and walls that kept the wind out and a roof to shed the rain. In the meantime, people had been moving into the settlement. The Jennings family adjoined us on the north, the Brenner family to the west of us across the Stockton Wash, the Scott family west of the Brenners, the Sparks family to the southwest on the Stockton Wash, the Paxton family south near our place, and the O'Brien family down the Wash, with the completion of the adobe meeting house in Lebanon, 3 miles to the west. A new roadway was cleared on a section line running due west from the old country road that we now call Highway 666. Lehi Smithson built at the corner intersection. Joe Hamblin on the road next to him. Tom Alger, Walter Woolsey, Frank Lee, Heber Dalton, John Will Mangum, John Lee, Ralph Lee, and the Windsors were all grouped conveniently near the new meeting house center. Church services were held each Sunday, and a school was held weekdays, and dances and other social activities were held in the evenings. Tom Alger was appointed bishop of the ward, John Lee was his first counselor, and my father, Henry Eudelus Russell, was his second counselor. At the dances, my father played the fiddle and Aunt Alice Brewer, the organ or guitar. Uncle Paul Gardner played the banjo, and sometimes the guitar for both round and square dancing. Some popular dance tunes of this time were Turkey in the Straw, K.C. Jones, Over the Waves, and Red Wings. Lebanon named. Andrew Kimball, who lived in Thatcher, had been appointed president of the St. Joseph Stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He also was serving in the territorial legislature. He visited the wards at conference time and gave the principal talk at meetings and conferred with ward officers, the bishop and his counselors. It was about 1906 when he and his wife managed a trip to the Holy Lands. Soon after their return from this trip, he visited our ward and told about his trip. In his talk, he compared Lebanon of the Holy Lands to our settlement. He said the climate was about the same, warm and dry. Water was scarce and brackish to the taste, and the ground in both places showed traces of salt and alkali. The contour of hills and small valleys, and even the vegetation was much the same. Since we had not named our ward up until then, he suggested the name of Lebanon. This name stuck as it applied to the ward and the vicinity of the meeting house. School days. After we had settled down in our new house, talk throughout the neighborhood centered on the need for a school. The Lebanon school was about 3 miles away, and too far for the smaller children to walk through the brush. After discussing the matter with county officials, it was learned that money for the establishment and operation of a school could become available from county funding. After a county supervisors meeting authorizing establishing a school district and election of a school board to implement plans for a primary school, Father was elected president, and the board proceeded with plans to build a schoolhouse and make ready for school by the following September. This was the spring of 1907. With county money to work with, parents in the district got busy on a new adobe schoolhouse. The procedure and construction followed roughly along the same lines as were taken to build our new house. Plans were drawn to build a small one-room of 12 feet by 20 feet with wood floor and pitched shingle roof. An adobe pit was started on the grounds, and soon the foundation was in place and walls were in progress. By the 1st of August, the building was up. No plastering was considered necessary. The new schoolhouse stood about 300 yards from our house. A new teacher was located. She was a little Texas woman by the name of Miss Archer, who later married a lawyer, Mr. Stratton, who served as judge of the Superior Court of Graham County for many years. She found board and room with the Higgins family about 3 miles over the hill in the area called Artesia. She rode a pony to school each morning. A typical morning school call included first grade, Chester and Lucy Jennings, Fred Russell, Claire and Stella Scott, Hazel O'Brien, Houston Hughes, O'Brien and Sophrona, Frony Strawn. Second grade, Gracie Sparks, Dempsey, Demp, O'Brien, Eric, and Dudley Brenner, twins. Third grade, Ada Sparks, Lovabelle Scott, Arthur Strawn, Irene O'Brien, and Bruce Brenner. Miss Archer was a strict disciplinarian, and about the second week brought 3 long willow switches, which she fastened to the wall near the blackboard and handy from her desk. She let it be known there would be no foolishness while school was in session. I was a slow learner. My attention span was very short and interest span in learning to read, practically nil. Couldn't see much use in using up prime marble playing time to decipher words from a string of letters. Hanan. This, of course, did not improve my deportment, and I spent much time daydreaming of recess time. The presence of the long switches on the wall tended to restrain me from open physical revolt, however. To cite a couple of incidents resulting from this imprisonment. One time, while we were standing up having our reading lesson, I noticed a rock about the size of a hen egg on the floor while Lucy Jennings, our best reader, was performing. I managed with one bare foot to slowly roll it up my other leg until I could reach it with my hand without stooping. I whispered to Chester from behind my Guffey reader and handed the rock to him when the teacher wasn't looking. Chester started to throw it out the open door we were facing, but missed the door. The rock bounced back and hit Hazel O'Brien on the head. Chester promptly got 3 whacks with a long switch for that, while the rest of the class looked on with long, somber faces as if facing the day of final judgment. Another incident, while we were supposed to be studying our reading lesson, my old dog, Spot, was barking at a stray cow that had wandered too close to the schoolhouse. Chester was looking out the window and became so engrossed he had forgotten he was in school. He yelled out, "Thicker Spot." For this, he promptly got a citation, but the switch was suspended that time. And the following is a little thought that could have been a misquote from the McGuffey's Third Reader, which formed attitudes and character-building thoughts in children of that day, and if used now would likely be in a big class action lawsuit between pacifist-oriented parents against the author and publisher for an attempt at corruption of morals and lives of children. This particular thought did, however, impress me and remained a signpost in my code of conduct throughout my lifetime. It goes, "When in battle, face your opponent toe-to-toe. Trade his punches, blow for blow. For if you falter and begin to run, your life's big problem has just begun. A bloody nose, a blackened eye makes men of boys in the near by and by." During this year, Edna and Tyler were riding Old Blackie to school at Lebanon, where they had the upper grades, 4th through the 7th. Edna, being the eldest, always held the reins and carried the club, while Tillis hung on behind, holding on to Edna with one hand and the dinner bucket with the other. On this particular morning, Edna, as was her nature, had become highly distraught by a late start and was urging the old horse along faster than his usual deliberate, slow trot. They came to an open wire gate with a big, long-horned cow standing in the gateway. The old horse, seeing his pathway partly closed by the cow, slowed up some. Edna impatiently whacked and kicked him. The old horse, afraid of the cow, reared up and Tillis dropped the dinner bucket and slid off the horse's rump, landing on the ground right next to the old longhorn that had not budged from her position, blocking the gate. Tillis was in such a panic he tried to go through, not under, the barbed wire fence, resulting in a disfiguring scar he carried throughout his lifetime. After getting old Blackie under control and the longhorn to yield her position, Edna impatiently retrieved Tillis from his panic, tore off a strip of her petticoat, wiped off the blood from his face, recouped the dinner bucket and some of its contents as best she could, and continued the journey of about 2 miles to school, of course arriving about an hour late. Emmer Plum, the teacher, after taking account of the blood and panic, suspended the rod on this occasion. On the 10th of June, 1908, a little brother Carl was born. He was a beautiful child with golden hair, fair skin, and brown eyes. The second year of schooling in the Russell District, our teacher was my Aunt Ina Brewer, a recent graduate of the Tempe Normal School. She was married to my mother's brother, Uncle Adam. Her teaching methods were as relaxed as those of Miss Archer had been rigid and strict. Soon after this term started, a pall of sadness fell over the entire settlement, caused by the death of Grandma Brewer, who had supervised many births and had given herself freely in helping with much of the illness in the community. She was laid to rest in the Safford Cemetery. This was my first experience with death. Now, Aunt Ina spent much of her time entertaining by reading stories. Peck's Bad Boy, Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, Jim Bridger's Adventures. As a pioneer hunter and trapper, Swiss Family Robinson and Widow O'Callahan's Boys. She planned parties for Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas with recitations, songs, and tabloids. This was a made-to-order curriculum for me. Why learn to read when someone who could do it much better would read for you? I love stories, but songs were for girls, women, and the birds. But even songs were much preferred to those switches of the first grade. Some highlights I remember in planning the Christmas party were, the teacher asked, "What would be nice to use to decorate the Christmas tree?" Hands went up and various ones suggested mistletoe, bells, stars, etc. "Fine, who will bring the mistletoe?" I raised my hand. I remembered a cottonwood tree with a big clump with plenty of berries. "Now who could bring a bell?" "Yes, marm, I got one, but it's got the dingler lost." Eventually the Christmas party was planned with a Christmas fairy. Our little sister Ina, preschool, held the star in the tabloid. Another event developed from our change of interest in marble games to trapping, brought on by the stories of Jim Bridger exploits in the frontier days as a trapper associate of Buffalo Bill. We acquired a few steel traps and I set one in a likely hole on the side of a hill we would pass on our way to school. On their way to school one morning, Chester and his cousin, Albert Hamblin, checked out my trap. Sure enough, a skunk had been caught. Albert stood back and threw rocks at it, but Chester found a stick to clobber her with. His advance was met by a spray from Mrs. Skunk, and Chester got plenty. Not knowing what to do, he set out for school. Within 50 paces, all the kids and the teacher could smell him coming. As Chester advanced to 40, then 30 paces, his presence became increasingly stronger. About 25 paces, the school population was clustered around the teacher, each holding his nose. She threw up her hand in a "Don't come nearer" sign and said, "Chester, what have you been doing?" Chester said, "Nothing. A skunk done it." Teacher, "Don't come any closer. Go home and bury yourself." Chester said, "Yes, marm." In a dilemma as to what would happen when his ma found out, he turned and ambled off with Albert, following at a comfortable distance behind. This school year, as compared with my first, was a carefree and a happy one. Aunt Ina was a genius in using meager resources to make events memorable and our lives more meaningful. The Christmas program was made with songs and recitations, and the schoolroom was decorated with cotton batting to look like snow. Stars were cut from cardboard and decorated with tinfoil, and the bells, even without dinglers, were hung around the room. Ina was a Christmas fairy holding a tinfoil star cotton batting snow and asparagus spray. There was a recitation by little Lawrence Brenner, first grade. In his gruff, bass voice, he said, "What will we do for bacon now? Sambo shot the sandy sow. She jumped the fence and broke a rail. Sambo shot her in the tail." In the spring of 1909 came Easter with songs, egg hunts, chicks and bunnies, and May Day, with more songs and braiding the maypole. All were memorable and jolly happenings in our school. But events which were occurring out of school were far more somber and tragic than one can imagine. The appearance of Halley's Comet, unannounced in the evening sky, traveling toward the western horizon at tremendous speed, trailed a stream of fire and headed for the high crest of Mount Graham, only a few miles from where we stood. Would it crash and destroy the Earth? This was a breathless moment. Older people had described this event as a prelude to the Day of Judgment. No news media had prepared us for this event or explained the phenomenon that confronted us. To me, this was a frightening experience, as some of our elders had talked of the signs of the last days. Speculation ran rampant after the climax of the first orbit passed. Some felt sure the next would be nearer the Earth, collide and thereby fulfill the prophecy of doomsday. Others considered it a warning sign. After the third night without a calamity, the tension subsided and other problems developed. Typhoid epidemic. Aunt Ina's husband, Uncle Adam Brewer, and his brother Hiram had made a deal with Amos Cook, a rancher, to buy his goat ranch on the Black Rock Wash, in which flowed a lovely stream of cold, clear spring water from the north end of Mount Graham. Their camp and ranch headquarters were located in an idyllic spot on the stream, shaded by giant oak and sycamore trees. Frank, my eldest brother, was camped there with Uncle Hiram's family. Aunt Katie cooked, and the rest were occupied with repairing fences, pens, and attending to the goats. Unbeknown to them, a family from the Gila Valley who were convalescing from typhoid fever camped upstream from them. In a short time, the fever struck. Uncle Hiram and his whole family, Uncle Adam and Frank, all came down with the fever and returned to our place for help. Dr. Platt, my first contact with a doctor, was called in. He had no effective medicines to fight the disease or to immunize others from taking it. He prescribed bed rest, light food, shade, and fresh air. Lucky for us, the cottonwood trees my father had planted had grown tall enough to furnish plenty of good shade. It was about April, and the weather seemed ideal. Pallets were scattered all over the yard under the shade trees, and the pallets were occupied by the sick. As some recovered and began to convalesce, others came down with the fever to occupy the empty pallets, keeping 8 to 10 filled for weeks. For food, we had the black bass fish Father had planted in the pond. They had grown into 2 or 3 pounders. Then there were rabbits and quail in abundance. It was up to us to devise methods of obtaining these things for food. Broiled fish and quail broth were ideal foods for our sick patients. To catch the quail, we built figure-4 quail traps made of strips of wood, starting with 4 pieces of 1 inch by 2 inches by 16 inches for the bottom frame, and adding 1 inch by 1 inch strips alternately log cabin fashion, drawing them in as each course was added until at the top the opening was about 4 feet by 4 inches. This was plugged with a shingle wedged in place to keep the birds from getting out, but permitting the trapper to withdraw his catch, 1 bird at a time. The trap was set with 3 sticks, the stand, the flipper, and trigger, and was baited with grain, wheat, maize, or barley, sprinkled under and around the trigger. Coveys of quail would swarm under the trap to pick up the fee, touch the trigger, letting the trap fall, catching 4 or 5 birds at a time. As for fish, all kinds of strategy was used to obtain them from the pond. We found small minnows or large tadpoles were the best bait for our hooks. When all else failed, enough water was withdrawn to allow us to catch them with our hands or a pitchfork in the shallow water. As kids, we found a No. 2 galvanized wash tub and excellent boat, sitting in the bottom with legs crossed. We could push off the pond bank at the water's edge and use our hands for paddles, and we could go anywhere we wished on the pond surface. This came in handy one summer after a bolt of lightning had struck a tree on the pond bank, resulting in the electrocution or shocking the fish so that 10 or 12 were killed and floated on the water surface. We quickly retrieved them by using our tub boats. My mother was strong for gardens. With Tylis and my help, we had plenty of black-eyed peas which she cooked green at the snapping stage. Green corn, squash, sweet potatoes, melons, carrots, okra, and tomatoes were grown in abundance. This with milk from 2 cows, supplied ample food for our sanatorium. With all this sickness, we were blessed to pull through with only one death, that of my grandma's brother, a man in his 60s, Uncle Joe Follett. He died with the fever. On the 24th of March, 1910, we were saddened by the loss of our little sister, Ina, about 6 years old. This death was from causes other than the fever. The fever epidemic had run its course by late summer. Frank, being one of the first to take it, was one of the first to recover. After his strength returned, he took a farm job in the Safford Valley, coming home on Sundays for clean clothing. In the summer of 1909, we lost grandfather, who in his late 60s suffered from a heart condition aggravated by loneliness, formed the loss of his mate, Grandma Brewer. His remains were laid to rest beside her in the Safford Cemetery. Aunt Alice, Mother's maiden sister, came to live with us. She is the one I mentioned earlier, who was a good reader and read them out loud to the family. We like these stories so much that members of our household often referred to our home on the Stockton Wash as Sleepy Hollow. How Cactus Flat got its name. One Sunday while the family was at Lebanon in church, Frank came home. But before he left to go back to his job, he left a cartoon he had drawn. The picture was of a young man lying on his back, a rock for a pillow, shoes off to one side, barefoot cooling off, hat over eyes, and his companions in the shade of a cholla cactus were a coiled rattlesnake, desert tortoise, Gila monster, roadrunner, and a scorpion. The caption on the cartoon was, "Shading up in Cactus Flat." Mother thought the picture described the situation so well that she framed it and hung it up over the fireplace. To those of our family, the name Sleepy Hollow was promptly changed to Cactus Flat, and soon its use became popular with others to designate the area on the Stockton Wash. Few people really knew how the name originated. Baptism. In 1909, I would be 8 years old in September and was told one day by my mother that I was reaching my age of accountability. This, she explained, was when I should be baptized. She explained that baptism was an ordinance established by Jesus Christ. She told me that baptism would wash all my sins away that I had committed up to the time of my baptism. But after that, I must be old enough to be responsible for my own sins. I immediately thought of the times Tillis and I had hidden behind the pond bank and smoked cedar bark, corn silk, and almost anything that made smoke, rolled up in newspaper. I wondered how she had found out. On another day, I had hitched Old Fan to the buggy to take her to a relief society, a woman's study group that usually met at the meeting house on Tuesdays. As I drove the mare, Mother sat beside me nursing my infant brother, Carl. It was a beautiful picture. She had fair skin, soft blue eyes, long honey hair, and was in the prime of her motherhood. We talked some about religion, and she mentioned the word reincarnation. I asked her what that long word meant, and she explained that it was a belief that people were reborn with a new body after they had lived a full life and had worn out their old bodies and died. She further explained that life's purpose was a stage of developing the spirit to a higher plane of perfection until at some future time we might become perfect like Jesus. I do not know whether reincarnation was a tenet of her own belief or merely a subject for discussion at her meeting for that day, but it answered a religious question I had been pondering, but unable to solve up to that time. According to most religious doctrines, when one dies, he does not come back in a new body, but must wait for the morning of the resurrection, at some future time, to take up the one he has laid down at death, which was imperfect to begin with, and after having deteriorated in the grave for perhaps centuries, it, in my mind, would be of no value. This slow process would also slow up the Lord's plan of spiritual development and make the efforts of trying to improve each day meaningless. Soon after my birthday, I was baptized in Aunt Annie Lee's pond by my father and confirmed by Bishop Tom Alger. Following is an expression of my thoughts I feel and have written concerning resurrection. Thoughts about resurrection. I've often wondered if resurrection may be life's power to reunite with its carnal mate of antiquity, in skit of adventure, in joy, or in pain, a dance with companion towards spiritual gain, a waltz with old partner in the rhythm of time, to recoup an experience, be it sad or sublime, to learn from a lesson shared eons ago. With earth's companion reunited with terrestrial elements below, if mortal being be a trident of spirit and blood, with third dominant power impelling from mud, a slime-encrusted creature toward heavenly crest, a step at a time and often regress, but steady the climb toward perfection's high goal, to share with our Lord heaven's full bowl, where both soul and the flesh will be peers in perfection, immortal at last on the day of resurrection. Another incident that happened soon after my baptism that made me feel the nearness of the Lord was how he saved me from a horrible death. I had a trap set in a hole in a bank of a branch of the Stockton Wash just west of our pond bank. In checking it out, I found a big pack rat. I removed the rat, reset my trap, and started to take the rodent to the cat. Barefoot as usual, I moved slowly along at half pace, looking at the rat and unmindful of where I stepped. Suddenly, I glanced down as my foot had reached its zenith and saw a coiled rattlesnake directly under my uplifted foot, its head raised within inches of my bare foot. In panic, the mechanics of self-preservation automatically took over, and my stride extended a yard or more as I sailed over the rattler. In some miraculous way, I had escaped the reptile. The pent-up breath in my lungs released with a snarl of a wounded bobcat as I made my way out of the thicket to higher ground. Trip to Bisbee. Dad, by his nature and lifestyle, was a perfectionist in his work. What he did well, but he was so deliberate and slow that his daily accomplishments were very low. Because of this, he had difficulty in holding construction jobs for which he was best qualified. He could do beautiful masonry work and was a good carpenter. He loved to talk and visit with people. For this reason, he preferred working for himself. He found he could make money peddling. He and Uncle Hiram Brewer, Dad's brother-in-law who lived nearby, bought a couple of wagon loads of farm produce, fruits, melons, potatoes, and planned to peddle them in the mining camp of Bisbee, which was roughly 100 miles from home. It required about 3 days' travel each way and 2 to 3 days to sell the produce. Uncle Hiram, his wife Aunt Katie, and son Fred, my age Dad, and I took off early one morning in 2 covered wagons. We had a used oak whiskey keg covered with burlap insulation that we filled with fresh drinking water, a chuck box, bedrolls, and camping gear that we fastened to the wagon side. The slow pace of the team enabled Fred and me to easily keep up on foot to do our assigned job of hunting rabbits to supply the meat ration. Each of us, barefoot as usual, carried a single-shot .22 rifle. Fred took one side of the road and I took the other. This was my first trip away from home, and as I had anticipated the trip with considerable eagerness for several days, I was having great fun seeing new country as the wagon trail paralleled low hills forming the southern end of the Mount Graham Range. The trail was rough, and much time was lost dipping in and pulling out of the many arroyos along the hillside drainage system. Water from storms and flash floods flowed eastward toward the San Simeon Valley, extending on our left for 15 to 20 miles to the beginning of the Chiricahua Range, extending southward into Mexico. This range formed a continuous backdrop from the Gila, gaining altitude as it extended southward to an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet. The extreme ruggedness of its crest had provided a suitable pathway for the famous Apache Indian chief, Cochise, to escape into Mexico when cavalry platoons pursued him as a scapegoat to placate the early settlers in frequent quarrels with this tribe. At about midday, we stopped to rest the teams and to eat a lunch prepared by Aunt Katie the night before. The horses were unhooked and set free to browse on bunch grass growing nearby. A cool, refreshing drink was withdrawn and shared from the water keg. We then took a moment to gaze at the landscape at leisure, which revealed 2 large projections resembling heads on the highest crest of the Chiricahuas. Dad told us these were called Dos Cabazos. Prevailing colors of the mountain scenery were various shades of lavender, changing to purple and blue as lights and shadows change. The foreground was forested with mesquite and catclaw, stunted for lack of moisture. A few cattle were observed browsing on bunch grass and mesquite beans growing in the arroyos. Various species of cacti, creosote, and yucca dominated the broken hillside areas, sloping to more level plains of the San Simeon Valley, tilted northward to drain into the Gila River. All of this was public domain, and at that time was free to the settler to use without restrictions. After the short rest period, teams were rehooked and our journey continued. Within an hour, we had reached the southern end of the Mount Graham Range, and were descending into the large Sulphur Springs Valley. The expanse of this level field of prairie grass, almost waist-high, seemed enormous to me. Many cattle were grazing peacefully on the unfenced pasture land, dotted with an occasional windmill pumping stock water. A few mesquite, yucca, and cacti were observed. The high range of the Chiricahua bordered the valley on the east, but the flat level plain appeared endless to the south. After another 3 hours on the wagon trail, we came in view of the little cow town of Wilcox. Stock pens for handling cattle, a few dozen board houses along the trail, a general store, saloon, Chinese restaurant, and blacksmith shop about made up the town. Finding a favorable place to camp near the village, we pulled off by the side of the trail and unhooked the teams, hung nose bags of grain over their ears, brought out the camping gear, such as Dutch ovens, mixing pans, flour sack, and lard bucket. We built a campfire with brushwood found nearby. Fred Brewer and I had killed plenty of cottontail rabbits and set about skinning and preparing them for supper. Aunt Katie was tending the cast-iron Dutch ovens and mixing dough for hot biscuits. Dad peeled the potatoes while Uncle Hiram removed the nose bags and hobbled the horses, freeing them to graze the abundant grass nearby. The campfire blaze died down, leaving glowing coals and hot ovens soon loaded with biscuits, rabbit, and sliced spuds. Lids replaced and covered with glowing embers. The pleasing aroma of good food wafted on the cool evening air whetted our appetites to a high pitch. At last, the heavy lids were removed from the smoking ovens. Fred and I had walked most of the 40 miles traveled that day, hunting rabbits, and were empty as a couple of young, starved coyotes. Supper over, horses checked, bedrolls laid out on the ground, we soon were asleep under the stars. At sunup, after a breakfast of pancakes with bacon was eaten, and we were soon on our way. That day, we made about 45 miles and camped near a small mine near Gleason, and arrived in Bisbee about noon on the third day. Bisbee was booming and came as near being a big city as any town in the territory at that time. Electric trolley cars served the city and extended to Douglas, 30 miles eastward. The Copper Queen was one of the biggest and richest strikes in the territory. We found a ready demand for the produce we were hauling, and both wagons were unloaded that afternoon. To me, Bisbee, filled with bright electric lights and trolley cars zipping up and down hills, was something I had no idea existed in the world. It fascinated me to see the trolley pole arc from time to time, as the cars traveled on the steel rails at unbelievable high speeds. Luxurious hotels and amusement places, stores, saloons, and restaurants lined the streets that were paved with brick or flagstone. I had never seen pavement or electric lights before. While our fathers were selling their produce, Fred and I sat in one of the covered wagons. A man walked up the sidewalk and paused in front of a saloon. He stuck his hand in his pocket, withdrew it, looked at something in his hand, then disappeared inside the saloon. I saw a glint of sunlight as something he had held in his hand dropped to the gutter. After he had gone, I ran over to see what he had dropped and found a shining new quarter. It was the biggest coin I had possessed in a long time. I returned to the wagon to show Fred what I had found, asked him what he thought we should do with it. Both of us being hungry, we decided to spend it on something we could eat and could buy the most of with our money. We both went to a big general store brimming full of merchandise to shop, one thought in mind: it must be edible and the most a quarter could buy. We finally settled on licorice whips with about an 8-inch handle and a 16-inch lash, a penny each. We shot the works for licorice and returned to the wagon with a big bag of 25 whips, which lasted us for weeks. The wagons unloaded of the produce, we pulled out toward home and camped a few miles away for the night. My mind was filled with amazement at the wonderful new things I had seen in the big city, and with regret that we could not have enjoyed them longer. With an early start before sunup and with empty wagons, we arrived in Wilcox about dark that evening, camping near the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith was still working by the dim light of his forge, sharpening some cold chisels. He pulled one out of the fire with tongs, hammered the glowing point to a sharp cutting edge, threw it on the dirt floor to cool, pumped the forge bellows a few times to renew the heat in the forge, then withdrew another chisel from the fire and hammered it on his anvil. I stood watching him and became curious as to how the smoke from the fire got out. I saw no smokestack. Stepping nearer to observe, my barefoot landed on the hot chisel. For a moment, I smelled an unsavory odor of burning flesh, but as the heat penetrated the thick rind of my foot, reflexes came into action. I jumped and squalled like a cat on a hot stove and hobbled back to camp with my curiosity satisfied. Aunt Katie examined the deep brand on the bottom of my foot and doctored it with baking soda, which cooled the burn and eased the pain. I rode in the wagon the next day, enjoying my licorice. Rabbit hunting was postponed for some time. The flume, returning home with money in his pocket, Pa set out looking for another way to increase his assets. He made a trip to town and contracted to cut logs for the Mount Graham Saw Milling Company that had a new steam plant. It was delightful and invigorating. I felt at home on burro back and in the excitement of the new venture, had forgotten the pain of my burned foot. We reached the sawmill about midday and were assigned to a worker's cabin and sat about arranging our meager belongings. A fire was made in the wood-cook stove, which served for both cooking and heating the cabin. At this high elevation, heat was needed. After a hasty lunch, Pa and Ernest set out with the logging foreman to look over the job site, while Mother and I remained at the cabin. I was impressed by the big steam boiler and wondered how they had managed to transport such a huge and heavy load on burros. The sawmill was running, and great logs riding the carriage zipped through the whirling saw, dropped a slab, and returned for a new cut in seconds. Each slab moved forward over roller tables through two edger saws spaced to accommodate the maximum width of useful lumber in the slab. Waste trimmings from the board dropped on a conveyor chain that carried and dumped it on the waste pile, while the slab was carried through the saw table, cutting it into dimensional lumber. A cut-off saw added the third dimension to the new finish boards. Each was dropped in the flume and zipped out of sight in an instant, to the stacking yard at the foot of the mountain, 19 miles via flume below. All operations seemed so efficient and effortless, and it amazed me to believe them possible. The cool mountain air, almost cold, mixed with wood smoke from the furnace, steam vapor from the engines, along with the aroma of the pine forest and freshly cut logs, gave off a perfume of an entirely new world too complex to describe, but most exotic and pleasing to me. A view of the valley below from the high mountain crest was a new vista in my lifetime. I imagine that's how the Lord keeps track of everyone from his throne high in heaven. As evening shadows began to fall, Pa and Ernest came into camp bearing their long cross-cut saw and axes on their shoulders. Mother pulled out crisply browned biscuits from the oven as they entered the cabin after washing up. The aroma and taste of the hot food, sweet potatoes, beans, and water gravy, with buttered hot biscuits and Mother's peach preserves, satisfied every nook and cranny of an empty belly and every taste bud the food touched on its way down. After about 2 months' work in the forest, Dad became restless and wanted to leave the job. Word was sent to Frank to meet us at the Clough Ranch with the buggy to take us home. After we had walked within about 2 miles of the receiving point, Frank, Edna, and Tillis met us on the trail and proposed we have the thrill of riding the flume. Frank returned to the landing place to make sure we all got out without an accident. Then Ernest helped me get in with instructions not to become frightened and grab the sides of the flume, because if I did, at the great speed, my hands would be torn to shreds. A crossboard was placed on the sidewalls, and when ready, I was released into the swift water feet first in a sitting position. I sailed over the steep, rough mountainside as a bird, except without effort, sound, or vibration, across canyons and over huge boulders, brush, and treetops. The thrill was as if I were weightless, without a body. In moments I was in Frank's arms and out of the flume. Tillis, Edna, and Ernest followed later, but used the crossbar to get out. Mother and Dad followed on foot. We all returned home, Dad and Mother in the buggy and rest on foot. Ernest, who had been dreaming of leaving home to get an education, earned a small nest egg on the logging job, and as a new term was soon to begin, he packed his clothes and went to Tempe to enroll in the teacher's college. Our first burros. In looking after our cows that grazed on the open flats and hills, Tillis and I noticed a couple of burros roaming the hills. They were gentle and didn't object to being ridden. We could just climb on and go places by slapping them on the opposite side of the head to make them veer in the direction we wished to go. As that was just after the world champion boxing fight, Jess Willard winning from Jack Johnson, Tyler named his burro Jack, and I named mine Jess. To induce them to stay around, we pulled weeds and fed them each day. Soon we became good friends, and instead of walking the range to bring in the cows each evening, we rode the burros. This went on for several weeks, until we became so attached to the animals we wanted to own them. Upon inquiring around, we finally found they belonged to the Halderman brothers, a couple of old bachelor prospectors who lived over the hill to the east of us. Soon we contacted and propositioned them to sell us the burros. Of course, we had no money, but were anxious to know how much they would cost. After a little bargaining, they set the price of $3 each. Now the big question, how would we get $3 each? It so happened it was about time for another school term. Mother was one of the trustees of the school district, which would need its supply of firewood to feed the pot-bellied heating stove. It was estimated there would be a need for 2 cords of stove wood. We immediately submitted a bid of $6 for the job. Our bid was accepted by the board. Now where were we to find some axes to chop the wood? Our old axe had a broken handle and had not been sharpened since it was new. After some searching, we found a piece of hardwood that could be, with considerable rasping and cutting, fashioned into a usable handle. We found an old drawing knife and dull rasp that had belonged to Grandpa Brewer. Eventually our axe with a new handle was assembled, and after grinding the blade on Dad's old grindstone for about 4 hours, it was ready for use. There were plenty of mesquite bushes, and we started on the biggest one nearby. Tyler chopped for a while, then turned the axe over to me. The wood was tough, and the axe handle was rough. Soon blisters began to show. Progress was painfully slow. Neither of us had any idea of how much it would take to make a cord. When we had dinner, we asked Aunt Alice. She didn't know, but looked it up in the almanac. One rack 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 4 feet high. Since in this instance we were chopping stove wood, we would need 2 ricks of 2-foot lengths instead of 1. We worked several days, but the progress was so disheartening, we decided we would have to get another axe somehow. Finally, we went to the Halderman place and explained our plight. They loaned us 2 good axes. After about 3 weeks of grueling hard work, we filled our contract by delivering the wood, all neatly racked and measured. Mother, being a member of the school board, we anxiously looked to her for our pay. One day she went to Safford and, after coming home, opened a package. She showed me a new suit with knee-length pants that she had bought with my $3. I immediately set up a strong protest. "I don't want pants, I want my burro," I wailed. Unfolding the garments, trying to pacify me by pointing to the nice strong fabric they were made of, she unfolded the pants, and the first thing I looked for were the pockets. To my consternation, there were none. Then I did take on. "Look, Ma, no pockets." "But what a pretty color. That makes up for the pockets." "I want pockets. I would rather have pockets than the old pants." She finally patiently appeased me by promising to make some pockets. I don't remember what Talis got for his $3, but it wasn't a burro. By this time, school had begun with a new teacher, Mrs. Maud Pace Callison, a daughter of one of the most affluent merchants in the county, W. Pace, who with others had established the Big Six hardware company of Thatcher. Maud's husband, Mr. Callison, was a teacher also and had contracted to teach in the Artesia district, a small one-room school about 3 miles south of the Russell district. Within a short time he became ill, and both schools were dismissed for a few days, opened and again closed for the same reason. He finally gave up and resigned on account of his poor health. Both schools remained closed until new teachers could be found and hired. Our school was fortunate to hire a young teacher who had just graduated. Miss Ivy Soule, she was a vivacious and lovely person who seemed to enjoy the association with the children. She read stories and played games, creating a pleasant and happy atmosphere in the schoolroom, and indulged in the spirit of sportsmanship on the playground. She played marbles, hopscotch, dare line, and other fun games with zest, as though she were one of us. One Saturday, Tillis and I decided to hook up one of the burros to the buggy. Getting a horse collar, we padded it up to fit the donkey. We fitted the harness and buckled it on, fastened the tugs to the single tree and shafts to the back strap, and planned to take our new school teacher for a buggy ride. But the donkey seemed to have a better idea. He would not budge a step. We coaxed, whipped, and even tried to push him, but he would only hump up. Miss Sowell entered into this fun with the same enthusiasm as we did. We all had fun, but no ride. He was a pack, not a pull, burro. New desert homestead. During the past years, Congress had made some changes in the homestead laws. One provision which applied to this arid region in the Southwest was the allowance of a desert claim, which doubled the 160 acres homestead filing to 320 acres desert filing. There were some technical differences, but the general purposes and procedures were similar. Those who had filed a homestead claim were also allowed to file a desert claim. Father made a filing on some brush land about 3 miles north towards Safford from our cactus home on the school land. This new district was dubbed Fairview. According to the requirements, a dwelling must be built and residence established and occupied for a stipulated period of time. To meet these rules, Dad built a small 2-room adobe house. Mother Tillis and I moved in during the summer. Since our livestock, orchard, and most of our belongings were in Cactus, much of our time was spent en route between the two places. Uncle Hiram Brewer and his family filed adjoining our claim and erected a small cabin and took up residence about a quarter-mile from our domicile. 2 Markovich brothers, Mark and Sam, immigrants from Italy, made filings and erected homes for their families. The Shirley brothers, Adolphus and Sam, and John Spear, a brother-in-law from Georgia, each filed and established a claim. The Lively family and others from the Lebanon and Artesia communities filed and established residences. A new adobe 1-room school building, about 20 feet by 30 feet, located about 300 yards from our house, was finished by midsummer to accommodate children of these new settlers. At church one Sunday, our bishop, Tom Alger, approached my father and said, "Henry, I've been considering asking for a release as bishop of the ward. I've served now for nearly 10 years. I hear there has been some cattle rustling going on out east of here in the Seneca country, and I think I would like to try for the job of county sheriff in the election that is coming up. What do you think, Henry? Think I can win?" Dad replied, "Tom, in my opinion, there's no better man in the territory. Congratulations." Extending his hand, promptly clasped by the bishops, the 2 old friends embraced. Tom Alger was a huge man, trim frame of sinew and bone, heavy chin, big square jaw, smooth-shaven except for a heavy black walrus mustache. His bearing was that of a sincere man with complete confidence, but with a soft voice, a hint of almost an apologetic ring to it. Dad said, to see him on his horse, wearing working tools, a bullet-filled cartridge belt, his holstered .44, a loaded bandolier of Winchester shells and carbine, 30-30 would put a chill in the old devil's backbone. He was truly one of the great lawmen of the Southwest. Although without the publicity that went to Wyatt Earp and John Slaughter, he certainly was a deserving member of their league. A story came out that was reportedly told by one of his deputies that, when he ran into a truculent character, all Tom needed to do was to whisper in his ear, and up went the bandit's hands. Tom served Graham County as sheriff for many years. Another Sunday, at the meeting house, a traveling showman appeared. He carried the first moving picture seen in the country. The title of the film was The Crucifixion of Christ. He had a carbide light with a hand-cranked projector. After contacting John A. Lee, our new bishop, arrangements were made to show the film. As the showman had no screen and the Lebanon meeting house had never been plastered, its walls were unsuitable for use as a substitute screen. Someone remembered the new Fairview School recently had one wall plastered with a smooth coat of mud. It might serve as a screen. All church members present, and many others who heard of the marvelous new invention, enough to fill the school to overflowing, went to see the great new marvel. It truly was a miracle in my young life. How can pictures be made to walk? Of course not. In those days, no one had ever imagined they would ever learn to talk also. Bounty hunters. The spring and summer rains of 1910 were heavy and frequent. With this abundant moisture, orchards and gardens responded with early blooms and lush growth. Rabbits, skunks, and other local varmints also increased in numbers, destroying crops and small chickens. They became so destructive that Graham County placed a bounty of 10 cents for cottontails, 15 cents for jackrabbits, and 50 cents for skunks. Rabbit ears and skunk hides were proof of their extermination. Payment was to be made in cash upon delivery of proof to the county treasurer's office in the county seat in Solomonville. Tillis and I, always looking for an opportunity to make a dime, got out our traps and put them to work. At the end of the summer, we had numerous rabbit ears and over 50 skunk hides. We hitched Old Fan to the buggy, loaded the proof, and set out for Solomonville to collect our bounty money. Upon arrival, we proudly presented our proof, but were informed, "Sorry, boys, but we had to lift the bounty last week. Just 1 week late, young fellows." Sorry. We were sorry and disappointed too. We did not know at the time, but learned later that a crooked employee of the treasurer's office had stolen and made off with the bounty funds. Living the classics. Our teacher for the new school was a lady from Texas, Mrs. Paxton. She was a pleasant person and spent most of her time entertaining us rather than teaching. No attempt was made to organize or conduct a graded school system. One book which impressed us most she read to us was Cervantes' Don Quixote, an old 16th century Spanish romantic classic which captured our interest and imagination, in which the hero became demented by reading too many fictitious tales of romantic chivalry. Imagined himself to be a knight-errant, shielded, mail coat and buckler, armed with lance and cutlass, mounted on his noble steed, Rocinante, accompanied by his trusted squire, Sancho Panza, astride his ass. The hero Don Quixote challenged and would joust with all comers, and when unable to find travelers, he would joust nearby windmills, which he fancied were enemy forces invading his homeland. This silly story, both humorous and dramatic, captivated our imagination and romantic impulse to the point that we picked the fair lady, our secret heartthrob, Ethel Spear, the loveliest girl in the school, as our queen, to defend and fight for her fair hand and honor. Though we had no Rocinante, we mounted stray burros, made shields of cardboard or old washtub bottoms, made a cutlass of wood and lances from dry yucca stalks growing nearby, and rode to joust with each other in the name of our secret lover, lovely Ethel, for whom we fought each other to dance with on Saturday nights. As the school ground had once been a bedding ground for range cattle that foraged on the brush nearby, a good supply of dried cow pies was always available to throw at our adversaries in our war games. This was in 1910, in the year of my 4th grade. Tylis, being 3 grades ahead, rode a little bay mare, Nancy, bareback, to the Russell District School that year. He, in his ugly duckling stage of development, long arms and legs with big feet, astride the little mare, with flailing arms and feet nearly touching the ground as he galloped over the hills. We dubbed as Ichabod Crane, after the character of the Headless Horseman story. His teacher was a Mr. Flurry from New York State, who lived with the Jennings family. He was a happy and friendly person who entered into all the pranks and games going on and helped invent a few we pulled on each other. Being a tenderfoot in the West, he saw a skunk in a bush and asked, "What kind of varmint is this?" We told him it was a pussycat, to hit the brush with a stick and it would run out. He tried it and was promptly sprayed. He took the prank in good part and laughed at his own stupidity. The next year, on April 13, 1911, a new baby sister, Eva, was born. A sister, Carter, an Adventist-trained nurse who had recently moved into the community, helped mother as midwife. Dad spent much of his time peddling and on other jobs away from home. Mother, Tillis, and I were stuck trying to live on the desert claim to satisfy filing requirements. We had no water except what we hauled in barrels. Our cattle herd at the Cactus Home had increased to about 20 head. We had no feed except the natural browse. Some cattle rustling had been experienced by those unable to keep a close check on their stock and on the open range. Mother was nervous about losing some of her stock and urged Tillis and me to repair and build fences to keep the cows up at night. Pa had grand ideas about drilling wells and farming the desert claim. On one of his peddling trips, passing through Wilcox, he found a man who owned an old well rig. Pa made a trade with him to swap Mother's cattle herd for his machine. He delivered the cattle but put off bringing the well rig home. Soon he had other urges which superseded the well drilling plans, and before long forgot about the whole deal. We had no cows to worry about. Suddenly, Pa decided he should devote more time to the Lord's work in bringing his genealogy up to date. His uncle Alan Russell, who lived in Fillmore, Utah, was interested. They corresponded for some time, then Pa took the urge. He somehow acquired a new buggy, new typewriter and camera, took our best horse, Old Prince, and left for Utah. A new teacher was contracted for the opening of the Fairview School in September. I was in the 5th grade but was scarcely able to read stories from the first reader. In the frequent spelling bees, I had a permanent place at the foot of the line, and or arithmetic, I knew nothing. I liked history because it was more like the storybooks teachers read to us. Our new teacher was Mrs. Queenie Gillespie. She, a young woman, was pregnant with her first child. Because of this, and her home duties, her mother, Mrs. Duncan, who had been an old-time teacher in Texas, did most of the work. Her teaching methods were much like those of our former teachers. More story reading. But she did spend some time teaching history. She taught us to recite the names of the presidents by rote. Wash, Ad, Jeff, Mad, Mon, Ad Jack, Van, Hare, Ty, Poe, Ta, Phil, Pierre, Boo, Lincoln, Joe, Grant, Hayes, Gar, Our, Cleve, Mack, Rose, Taft, who had just been elected in 1912. Many of the Mormon families from southern Utah had migrated to Mexico, settling in Sonora, Chihuahua, and other states near the border. They had received charters to colonize and land grants from the Mexican government and had succeeded in establishing a number of thrifty towns and business enterprises. Pancho Villa, a bandit of questionable lineage and nationality, some say from El Paso, formed a gang of bandito de caballeros hidden in rough mountain hideouts, raided targets of the more affluent Mormon enterprises, such as banks, stores, and warehouses. They finally became so bravado that they raided the border town of Columbus, New Mexico. They must have had a payoff arranged with some high officials of the Mexican government, for it paid very little attention to them. Finally, after the Columbus raid, General Pershing was ordered to pursue him into the interior. He made a cavalry expedition into Mexico, following the crafty old pirate, but no contact was made, and the general returned without success. The trepidation and insecurity of the Mormon settlers forced them to abandon most of their possessions in Mexico and return to the United States. Most of them settled in the bordering states of Arizona, New Mexico, and California. A few settled in the Safford cactus areas, on our own again. In the fall of 1913, Pa had left in the spring. Frank and Edna had been working in the valley and going to school as time would permit. As Pa had left us without support, Frank procured a cheap rent house in Thatcher, and the family moved in, with Frank its provider. He and Edna attended the Gila Academy for the 11th and 12th grades. Tillis was in the 8th and I in the 6th grade. I found conditions much different in the new city grade school. I was deficient in reading, spelling, and mathematics, and should have been demoted to the 3rd grade. But the teacher, Mr. Lofgreen, was very patient and tolerant with me. Outside the schoolroom, I had always been able to hold my own in tests of strength, which at that time was measured by one's ability to wrestle his opponent down and put all 4 points to the ground, and to also compete with my fellow schoolmates in tests of scholastic accomplishments. They were all about as dumb in reading, spelling, and arithmetic as I. Of course, the girls were much better, but we contributed this to what we postulated were simply girls' things and did not worry about it. Now it seemed different at the blackboard. Problems would be given to find the sum of these numbers. I knew what sum meant, but it did not make any sense to me when used in arithmetic. Or find the quotient of 360 divided by 3. Quotient, sum, dividend were Greek to me. My deficiency in reading and spelling was pathetic and of some great embarrassment, especially before an audience of pretty girls toward whom I was beginning to have amorous, secret thoughts. Such experiences were damaging to my ego, and I began to hate school. I could think of no way to compensate for my incompetence. My thought each morning was with dread of a new exposure of my ignorance. I began to hate life, wishing to die before the dawn of a new day. This complex feeling of inferiority, which seemed to suddenly come over me in all my social relations, made me timid and unsure. I sometimes wondered if I were losing my mind. As I grew older, it seemed to grow and thrive as a bad weed. It baffled me. I had no one to tell me I was just approaching the age of puberty. Journey to Chandler. In this year, on November 5th, 1913, our little sister Luella was born. She was the last child of my mother's family. The last half of the school year finally ended without any remembered events. All students graduating but me, I simply quituated. Mother received a letter from Pa, who had been living with Ernest in Chandler, who had been working for the Chandler Improvement Company. Pa told her that he had rented a 40-acre farm and wanted her to bring the family to Chandler and help him. In the weeks preceding our planned date of departure, let us take a look at the goings-on in the minds and attitudes of the kid logic of this day and consider the thoughts and conditions expressed in the nomenclature of the child's own language. Money, except for an occasional penny, nickel, or rare dime, was seldom ever come by in a kid's life in those days. It had little to do in terms of a medium of exchange. Most transactions were barter in exchange of marbles, pocket knives, whetstones, tops, balls, ball gloves, traps, and various kinds of ammunition. For instance, a box of 50-22 bullets could be bought for about 25 cents for shorts and 35 cents for long rifles. A box of 25 shotgun shells sold for about 70 cents for 16 gauge and 85 cents for 12 gauge. In the barter arrangement, most valuables were determined by barter values. As in marbles, a glassy or agate was worth about 10 doggies, a cheap clay marble. A steely, a ball bearing, about the right size and weight to make a good taw, a marble to shoot with, was worth 15 to 20 glassies. A ball glove would be worth a box of 50 long rifle shells or 6 or 7 12-gauge shotgun shells. The most prized possessions were always carried in the right-hand pocket. A good knife or ammunition was carried where it would be easiest to get out. Other plunder of lesser value was stored elsewhere. Boys in those days started hunting with a .22 rifle at about age 6 or 7. By the time he was 9, he would be allowed to take the shotgun, provided, of course, he had sneaked it out a time or two and proven his dependability, without Ma catching him. By the age of 12, he was considered by his peers to be a veteran small game hunter and might likely be allowed to go with an older boy carrying a .30-30 rifle to hunt big game. For some reason, the 12-gauge shotgun was the most popular for small game hunting in our community. If one acquired a 12-gauge and a 16-gauge shell, both could be shot in a 12-gauge gun. By carefully cutting the jacket of any empty 12-gauge shell just above the brass, a 16-gauge shell could be inserted with enough friction to allow the shell to be fired when placed in the 12-gauge firing chamber. At this time, a boy's great ambition as to occupation was to become a good hunter. Why? Because this was a man's most immediate and direct way to fill his belly from an adverse and sometimes hostile environment in the great but always dry southwestern frontier. Farming without water was out of the question. Grazing without cattle and capital was equally remote. It boiled down to learn to live off the land as one found it, or else. Hunting was not limited to the hunting of wild game, but was extended to the search for anything that might ease the pangs of an empty belly or parched throat. These things included in a young boy's life gathering and chewing skeet beans, prickly pear and barrel cactus apples, acorns, pecan nuts, walnuts, hackberries, squaw berries, etc. A barrel cactus could ease a parched throat and the debilitating craving for water. Lives have been saved from physical exhaustion from thirst by this desert plant, by slashing it open and eating the white meat that resembles the meat of a green watermelon. A lucky hunter, if alert, with some resourcefulness and experience, might even stumble on a hollow tree with a swarm of bees, called a bee tree, or cave with some delicious honey inside. Equipped with some experience, he would no doubt pay for the prized honey, but if clever and hungry enough, would come away quite content and happy with his reward in exchange for the punishment. This was not recommended for a novice, however. In planning for our long journey, Frank's ingenious skill in horse trading, Old Fan, our faithful family mare and servant of the past 10 years, was matched up with a bony old gray horse, Old Tobe of unknown age or lineage, for a long and rough trek across the frontier of Arizona during its second year of statehood. The old wagon wheels had been wedged and soaked overnight to retain their iron tires for the first day's journey, axles greased and wheels remounted by Frank and the newly appointed wagon mechanic, Tyler. The bows in place, canvas top stretched and properly secured, the water keg filled and mounted on the wagon side to serve for drinking, cooking, and emergency wheel soaking to keep the wood fellies and iron tires from separating. 2 bales of hay and a sack of rolled barley to supplement natural horse feed to be picked up along the way. The chuck box fitted with a new bucket of lard, a can of KC baking powder, a pound of sugar, some salt, a can of Eagle brand condensed milk to nurse the baby, along with a 25-pound bag of flour for biscuits and water gravy. These things in place with the bedroll, breakfast over, prayers said, asking for protection and guidance for a safe journey, Frank in the teamster's seat, Tillis beside him, Mother, Edna, Ava, and Luella under the canopy, sitting on the bedroll. I, old Buster, my faithful dog companion, an old fan's colt to trail behind, were about to set out. It was a beautiful sunny morning in Thatcher, about the first day of May, 1914. Mother, 43, had borne her last child, Luella, the past November. Frank, her eldest son and our brother, who always faithfully served in Pa's place as head of his family in his frequent and extended absences, had finished the 12th grade. Edna, 21, oldest daughter and fourth child, often mother's substitute in maternal leadership, had finished the 11th year of schooling at the Gila Academy. Tillis, 15, had graduated from the 8th grade under Doc Jones, principal of the Thatcher Grammar School. I had passed the 5th grade without honors, under Professor Lofgren. Eva, 3, was just learning to talk and growing up to be independent on her own good feet. Luella, an infant, frequently expressed her claim to personal freedom in her own way. All members of Pa's family at this time paused momentarily and looked back at Thatcher, and then took off on a great and momentous adventure by covered wagon from Thatcher to Chandler via the newly finished Roosevelt Dam, a distance of about 250 miles. At Frank's command, the team started. The wagon wheels creaked in protest under its load over the rough trail as it began to move westward. For most of the way from Thatcher to Globe, the trail paralleled the railroad track as it snaked its way around impassable barriers of gullies, large granite outcrops, heavy clusters of mesquite growth, and other inaccessible places. Tagging along most of the time in sight of the wagon, I was on the alert for cottontail rabbits to supplement the biscuits and water gravy I knew we would have for supper. Being late taking off and due to the slow pace of the team over the rough terrain, we planned to keep going until sundown. About 12 o'clock noon, we heard the whistle of the steam locomotive pulling the freight train from Bowie, junction of the Southern Pacific, to Globe. It came rumbling by with 10-oar cars and a caboose to stay overnight and return to Bowie the next day. I marveled at the great advancement in travel of the steam locomotive, pulling the heavy load 150 miles in a single day. Globe was about 80 miles from Thatcher, and we estimated it would take us 3 days to make it to Uncle Hiram's place, who lived there. About 3 o'clock, up ahead around a bend in the trail, I noticed a plume of dust rising, and shortly afterward heard a rumble, which turned out to be an automobile. As it plumed its dusty way over the chuck holes of the trail, there appeared one of our affluent Safford merchants, Mr. J.T. Owens, who recently acquired one of the first early automobiles of that day in Graham County. He wore leather leggings, the typical white duster coat of that time, a cap and goggles. The automobile was chain-driven, without lights, windshield, or top, resembling a buckboard with a high spring seat for two. Frank pulled off the trail for the new vehicle to pass, and Mr. Owens waved a thank you as he whizzed by at about 15 miles per hour. I had seen several cottontails run by and a few single quail, but my early training as a hunter had taught me never to take a chance on wasting ammunition, never shoot at a running target or a single quail, but to wait until one can get at least 2 birds at one shot. As the evening came on and game became more active, at last I shot a single rabbit with the cobbled-up 16-gauge shell I had been carrying in the chamber of my 12-gauge gun. Replacing the empty shell with one of my remaining 2 12-gauge shells, I spotted 2 quails together and killed them both with my second shot, our ancestors. On the 3rd day, we managed to reach Globe about sundown and were welcomed into the home of Mother's brother, Uncle Hiram Brewer, and his family. We also found Aunt Betsy McClive and her son, Jody, who had just arrived for a visit from Mother's old hometown of Pinedale. Mother and the members of her reunited family were soon deeply engrossed in reminiscent thoughts and conversation. I, a poor reader, but a good listener to good stories, found a corner where I could clearly hear the dialogue, sat through the hours until midnight, eagerly absorbing the scenario extending from the time Mother's first paternal ancestor, Thomas Brewer, and his brother came to America. Thomas and his brother embarked from London, England. They came by sailboat, the Lion, in 1682. They landed in Rhode Island but soon moved to the Connecticut Valley. Thomas took up land along the Connecticut River. He soon married and built a fine home. His first son was named Daniel, our ancestor. Daniel grew to manhood and helped his father to increase their land holdings. The virgin, fertile soil produced lush crops and bountiful harvests. Their holdings of land and chattels became one of the finer plantations in the Connecticut River Valley. Daniel soon married, and his oldest son took his father's name as Daniel Jr. As migration to the New World continued, encroachment of English settlers in the New England colonies from the east and French settlers from the north, in Canada, Indian tribes formed a confederacy called the Five Nations for self-defense. This powerful barrier to curb encroachment made it necessary for the colonizers to match the Indian defense with military troops to take the offensive. Daniel Jr., 26 at this time, was called to serve his colony. He left his bride, Ruth, and their two small children, joined a regiment of the King's Army being sent into the wilderness frontier. Ruth, pregnant when her husband left, had borne her third child, whom she named after her husband. But after losing her second child, William, she had died with a broken heart during her husband's extended absence. After several years fighting Indians, his regiment was sent north in an attempt to conquer Canada. Daniel Jr. served in the battles of Ticonderoga, Crown Point, Tippecanoe, and Quebec. After the failure of the expedition to conquer Canada, his regiment was returned, disbanded, and he was discharged to go home. His wife gone and both children grown up and married, Daniel III, our ancestor, had married Lydia Penfield from Chatham, Connecticut. Having sacrificed his family life by fulfilling his military obligation, Daniel Jr. applied for and was granted a charter to establish a ferry across the Connecticut River to serve the towns of Portland and Cromwell. This was in the year 1750. Let us digress for a moment that we may relate the events of this story to contemporary events of American colonial history. George Washington of the Virginia colony had reached the age of 18 at this time and was soon to be inducted into the colonial Indian Wars on the frontiers of Virginia. Looking forward 26 years to 1776, the Declaration of Independence had been signed by all the untied colonies. The Liberty Bell in its belfry in Independence Hall, Philadelphia, had rung out the glad tidings and heralded the coming war for independence. George had served his duty in the King's Army. Discharged, he became a full general to head the united colonial forces in this new war against the king. Daniel Jr., by this time an old and broken man, tending his ferry in Connecticut, was contacted by Patriots for Liberty to join in the war effort. He replied, "I'm in full sympathy with your cause, but I once gave my oath of allegiance to the king, and I cannot raise my hand against him." A new crop, tobacco, had been introduced in the Connecticut Valley. Daniel III had seen his neighbors become wealthy by growing it for a short time, but recognizing it to be a potential evil, a poisonous habit-forming drug, and to protect his young family from the misery of its use, decided to take no part in the production or to have his children live near others using it. He sold the family plantation and all his personal chattels, turned his back on prosperity, and took his small family into the uncertainties and hardships of the wilderness. Blazing his trail westward, the national census of 1800 located him, his wife Lydia, with two children in the town of Rochester, Ulster County, New York. 4 years later, on the 7th of July, 1804, my great-grandfather Louis Brewer was born. From Rochester, the family moved to Neversink, Sullivan County, New York. It was a small settlement in the high mountains west of Rochester. This was a heavily timbered country. Wildlife abounded in great numbers. Deer were more numerous than sheep. Wolves roamed in large packs and were destructive to flocks of sheep that ranchers were trying to raise. Streams were teeming with trout, which were so abundant that while mother fried them in the kitchen, her son was catching pounds of them a few paces from the kitchen door. In this lush, mountainous region, trees of all kinds were growing and timber was free for the taking. Daniel and his family became acquainted with a neighbor family who had been living in the mountain wilderness for some time. This was the William Wheaton family, who were coopers by trade. They could make anything from wood. Soon the two families became close friends, and the Wheatons taught the Brewers their trade. Not only was the existing friendship beneficial to both families, but Louis, son of Daniel and Lydia, won the love of Bithynia, daughter of William and Orpha Wheaton. The couple were married in 1827 at Neversink, New York. To this union, 7 children were born. My grandfather, Jacob Albert Brewer, the third child, was born 21st of June, 1833, at Sullivan County, New York. With the help of a village blacksmith, they made wagons, and by ox teams they moved westward. About 1850, they took up residence in Woodhall, Steuben County, New York. There they became acquainted with a young man by the name of Adam Campbell. Jacob and Adam became good friends. Both in their late teens, they were adventurous and talked about big things. Adam's father and mother lived in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He had been visiting an aunt and uncle by the name of Follett in Steuben County, New York. Adam had made a few boat excursions on the Great Lakes, and the stories he told made Jacob envious of his friend's superior knowledge and experience in adventures. After a few months together, the boys had talked of various possible job opportunities. Adam knew of railroad building projects going on in Canada and how he was sure they could obtain good jobs in Canada. Sometime after Adam had gone home, Jacob, reviewing Adam's tales of adventure and superior knowledge, became restless and dreamed of trying his own wings in the big world. The more he thought of it, the more restless he became. Finally, unable to contain himself, he announced to his parents his decision to join Adam and go to Canada. Their efforts to discourage this wild adventure met with little success. He had just sold a calf he had raised and still had the $20 in his pocket that would little more than pay his boat passage to South Haven, the nearest town to Kalamazoo. Finally, the day came, and he was determined to try his wings, which turned out to be his legs. He bid farewell to his family and set out. He hitchhiked 120 miles to the nearest port to embark at Westfield on Lake Erie. He then paid his passage of $15 and sailed for 15 days before landing at South Haven, Michigan, the nearest port to Kalamazoo. After that, he hiked another 50 miles to reach his friend's home. The two friends reunited after a few days' rest. They then went back on the shores of Lake Michigan, and with Adam's prior experience in thumbing his way, were embarked on a boat sailing northward with a cargo for Port Arthur, Ontario, Canada. The boat ride for grandfather Jacob, paying his fare by menial kitchen police, dishwashing, scrubbing deck, and captain's flunky, did not quite measure up to his fondest dreams imagined before he left home, but he bore with it until their landing. Inquiring about job opportunities, they finally were offered a job in a railroad construction camp in the deep forests of northern Ontario. This was in September. After more hitchhiking, they found both weather and camp conditions very rugged. Soon it became colder and colder. The job assignment was that of Gandy Dancer, a fancy title for handling heavy ties, rails, and other heavy equipment as the track-laying operation progressed. Most of the workers spoke only French or German, so the language handicap was difficult for a couple of green young men who knew only English. As the season progressed into bitter cold winter, bringing deep snows and sub-zero weather, work in the camps was suspended. During layoff spells, they received no pay, and accumulation of savings was impossible. They toughed it out through the winter. Because of drifted deep snow and no traffic, they were unable to leave the camp. As spring finally arrived, about the 1st of June, supply lines were reopened, and the two adventurers were ready to return from the frozen wilderness to the sparsely populated towns called Civilization, located on the northern shore of Lake Superior. Broken gaunt as a couple of young polar bears just out of hibernation, they walked the broken trail for miles. Their pay for this rigorous adventure: hardened muscles from heavy labor, a smattering of vulgar French and German words, worn-out shoes and clothing, and a compelling urge to get back to America. Coming south as fast and as far as energy and luck in hitchhiking would permit, they never stopped until they reached Adam's home near Kalamazoo, where they found the Brewer and the Wheaton families visiting the Campbells, all making ready to travel south to Council Bluffs, Iowa, to join the western trek across the plains to Utah. Before the families moved, Adam and Orpha Jane Wheaton fell in love and were married. This united the three families: Brewers, Wheatons, and Campbells. The two boys, Jacob and Adam, were soon on their way southward toward the warm sun. They had never appreciated its warmth so much. This was the summer of 1859. Arriving in Council Bluffs, the two boys were offered jobs as teamsters, hauling supplies to Salt Lake City. Jacob accepted, but Adam, being newly married, stayed with his bride. While waiting for a company of travelers to assemble for the hazardous trip to Salt Lake City, Adam's sister Rebecca became ill with a fever, later diagnosed as typhoid. While crossing the plains of Nebraska, she died and her body was buried on the lonely prairie near Kearney. Upon arrival at Salt Lake City, Louis, having heard of lush forests in northern Utah, turned northward. At a small community of Bountiful, the Campbells decided to settle, while the Brewers and Wheatons journeyed on to a small settlement of North Ogden. There they found forests which fully measured up their wildest dreams. Finding a favorable spot, they settled for the winter. It was late in September 1859, and the weather had become quite cold as the season progressed, and an unusually cold winter set in, with high winds, drifting snow, and sub-zero temperatures that seemed to never end. All trails were blocked for months that seemed like years. By spring, June, the trails were finally open, and hearing of the mild climate in southern Utah, St. George, often referred to as Dixie, because someone had grown cotton there. The Brewers were happy to leave their lush forests of the north in search of a warmer climate. Bithynia had contracted tuberculosis, and her suffering from the disease was greatly intensified by pioneer hardships during the long, cold winter. Retracing their trail in quest of forests, they returned to Bountiful to visit the Campbells, where they found Orpha Jane, who had assisted in the care of Rebecca, had contracted the symptoms of the fever and had died during the winter. The three families, reunited again, headed southward toward the warm sun in search of a milder climate, suffering many hardships as they journeyed for weeks. The Great Wasatch Mountain Range was on their left, and the shores of the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake on their right. The travelers passed through the small settlements of Provo, Payson, Nephi, Fillmore, Beaver, Parowan, Cedar, and finally arrived in St. George, Dixie, their destination. The spring climate was ideal, the fields verdant and orchards all in bloom. They camped for a short period to survey the possibilities. They finally settled on the banks of the Virgin River east of St. George. There they found timber to supply their needs to build log cabins and wood to ply their trade in making shingles, barrels, tubs, buckets, churns, and other items in demand by the pioneer families. Soon after settling on the Virgin River, they were made happy by the arrival of my grandfather Jacob, who had been driving freight wagons and guiding travelers from Council Bluffs to Utah. He told many interesting stories of his experiences since he had last seen them. Jacob, 30 at this time, had been timid and girl-shy, but this problem was soon solved by his old friend Adam, who introduced him to his cousin, Sabra Ann Follett, of a family who had come directly from New York to southern Utah. Although Sabra Ann was much younger than Jacob, she had a mind of her own and accepted Jacob's proposal against her parents' counsel. They were married in 1863. To this union, 11 children were born. The third child, my mother, was born at Big Cottonwood, a tributary of the Virgin River, on March 13, 1872. After living in Washington County, Utah, for nearly 20 years, the three families had become prosperous. The items of their trade had met with ready sale or barter. The climate of the area was rather cold for commercial cotton growing, but it produced fine grape crops. Soon the grapes were processed into wine, and this combination brought in a rough element of settlers who consumed it. Typical of the brewers, who had shunned prosperity of the tobacco production and its element, they did not wish to have their children live and associate with imbibers of alcohol, made possible by the production of their kegs and barrels. At this time, a call came through church channels from Brigham Young for volunteers to migrate to the Arizona Territory. The brewers heeded the call. My great-grandfather Louis' family, his three sons, Jacob, Joseph, and Charles, each with their families, planned to move to the new, sparsely populated frontier. Grandfather Louis was 75 at this time and was quite feeble to undertake another move. Grandfather Jacob, 46, with 7 children, along with Joseph and Charles, inventoried their belongings they wished to take along. On the last day before their planned departure, Joseph, who had been in ill health for some time, decided he was not well enough to make the trip and that he would stay with his father's family until his condition improved. The summer of 1879, the two brothers, Jacob and Charles with families, embarked on their journey in covered wagons pulled by ox teams and slowly proceeded down the trail toward Lee's Ferry, approximately 200 miles away. The progress was slow. The children cared for some 15 head of cattle, browsing them along as they went. By fall, they finally arrived at Lee's Ferry. There was some difficulty in loading the cattle when they reached the ferry. One steer jumped the side rails when the raft was in midstream, but climbed up the bank ahead of the others. Each wagon with team was loaded one to a trip, and finally the crossing was completed, allowing them to join other travelers going to the same destination at Joseph City, Arizona, some 400 miles away. The progress was painfully slow and the food supply was short. This was supplemented with game birds and animals found along the way. In the north, they found a good supply of pheasants, which they called saga hens, and with rabbits and occasionally fish found in running streams. Without these wild creatures to supplement their food supply, many pioneers would have starved. Names and dates of travelers preceding them were written with axle grease on the large flat stones they found along the side of the trail. The winter was very cold. High winds blew across the barren plateau with a high chill factor, making traveling and exposure extremely hazardous and dangerous to the health of the pioneer families who traveled in caravans for common protection. Those that had breakdowns, sickness, and other difficulties were left behind. Those who were able to keep moving did not wait for those unable to travel. Having a herd of cattle impeded progress. The Brewers finally arrived at the Joseph City Stockade on New Year's Day, 1880. At this time, the new transcontinental railroad, the Atlantic Pacific, was building grade in Holbrook, a settlement about 10 miles east of Joseph City. Many Mormon families found work on this job and were offered a contract, but while arranging for provisions in the town, they heard of a need for shingles to cover the housing being erected in the settlement. Of course, the Brewers preferred making shingles to working on the railroad grade. Looking for suitable nearby timber, they heard of a pine forest on the Mogollon Mesa, about 50 miles south of Holbrook. In a few days, their camp was pitched on a spot called Flakes Camp in the virgin pine forest located on the crest of the Mogollon Rim. They started felling trees and splitting out shakes and shaping them with drawing knives by hand. Able to sell all they could make, they soon built a shingle mill which enabled them to saw the shingles much faster, becoming affluent enough to build a sawmill to furnish lumber as well as shingles. The milling and logging operations attracted workers, and the small industrial settlement called Pinedale was established on the high rim country over 6,000 feet in elevation, sloping gently to the north and dropping abruptly called jump-off country to the south. As the little settlement grew, a church and schools were established. Gardens were planted, and the rainfall was found ample to grow corn, squash, beans, and clover without the need of irrigating. The open range offered good feed for the cattle. My mother had grown to become a pretty young lady by this time when a young man by the name of Henry Russell came along. Henry Eudelus Russell was born March 30th, 1863, at Fillmore, Utah. His father, Horace Russell, born March 10th, 1831, at Shelby, Macomb County, Michigan, owned a blacksmith shop in Concho, a small Mexican settlement about 50 miles east, near St. John's in Apache County, where Henry had grown up from a little boy. Hattie and Henry found fun dancing together in the Pinedale church house on Saturday nights. The romance developed to a proposal, which was accepted by Hattie. They were married the 7th of March, 1887. The first child of this union was named Henry Franklin, born January 28, 1888, at Alpine, called Bush Valley. Other children, Ernest, born December 24, 1890, Edna, born June 26, 1893, Eudelus, born July 24, 1898, all born in Eager, where grandfather Russell had moved his shop. In 1898, father was called on a mission in Kansas, leaving his young family with grandpa. Mother and father traveled with mother's brothers, Uncle Adam and Joseph Brewer, to Utah, where their marriage was sealed in the Manti Temple. Joseph, nearly blind with cataracts, proceeded on to Salt Lake City with father, who remained for a brief training for his mission assignment, while Joseph went on to Denver for his eye operation. Mother and Uncle Adam returned to her family in Eager. My grandfather, Jacob Brewer, 67 at this time, had been suffering from rheumatism called dropsy. He suffered severely with the painful disease. He had heard of a warm climate in the Gila Valley. The family disposed of their interests in Pinedale. Albert and Adam rounded up the ox teams for the trek southward from the high mountain altitude of more than 6,000 feet. On their way over the crest on the high rim, they found a beautiful pine forest in a small valley called Forestdale. They could not resist, so they settled, built log cabins, cleared off a spot, and planted a field of wheat. By fall, the grain crop was a beautiful harvest of large, full heads of wheat. Upon seeing Grandpa's fine grain harvest, the Apache Indians claimed his fields were a part of their reservation. Although it was later proven they were wrong, the Indian Bureau sided with the Indians and ordered Grandpa to get off. Mother's family at Eager decided to join her father's family, and with ox teams and a small herd of cattle, they traveled south, arriving in Safford in the fall of 1899. After checking out the settlements of Eden, Pima, Thatcher, Safford, and Solomonville, they finally picked a choice spot to view the majestic Graham Mountain. Here the story of my mother's people came to an end. Soon all participants in this dialogue had found a spot on the wooden floor. Wrapped in a quilt or blanket, and except for snoring, all was quiet. I lay awake about an hour reviewing the highlights of the thrilling adventures. From Thomas's arrival in America in 1682, Daniel the plantation builder, Daniel Jr. serving in the King's Army as an Indian fighter, in the French and Indian Wars and attempted conquest of Canada, of Daniel III, who turned his back on prosperity to save his family from the tobacco plague that might threaten the happiness of his family and of their trek in the uncharted wilderness of New York State. Then my grandfather Jacob's experiences in the frigid forests of Canada and hike back to Michigan and the subsequent hardships in the Utah Territory. To the Salt River Valley. When I awoke, the family was astir by 8 o'clock. Breakfast over, prayers and goodbyes said to our relatives in Globe, we were on our way toward the great, newly completed Wonder of the West, the Roosevelt Dam, about 30 miles away. We found the new road, built by the government to facilitate the construction of the Great Dam, much improved to the roads we were accustomed to. The road was downgrade most of the way and smoothly paved with decomposed granite. Toward evening, we came in view of the Great Lake, backed up for miles. This was the biggest body of water I had ever seen, and soon the big dam, constructed of huge granite blocks, taken from the mountainside, came into view. The sights were far beyond anything I had ever imagined. The crest was wide enough to accommodate 2 wagons to pass each other, protected on each side by 6-foot railings made of stone masonry. By sundown, the trail dipped steeply into the box canyon below the dam, bordered by the river's edge on the right and a perpendicular cliff of granite on the left. Following the smooth road a short distance below the dam, we soon found a camping place. It was sundown now, giving us a full view of the magnificent mammoth structure. I marveled at the great blocks of stone that had been removed from the canyon walls and fitted together so perfectly. This made me think of stories of building the Great Pyramids, the power plant generating electric power racing over long cables mounted on high towers of steel spaced about 500 yards apart, to light cities miles away, added to the marvels of the project, were thrilling beyond anything a small country farm boy from Cactus could imagine. Hot biscuits and water gravy was the menu for that evening meal. The next morning we were off to an early start. The road, not a trail now, followed the river as it twisted and turned in the deep canyon of granite cliffs, so high one could see only a blue patch of sky above. At some places we were so near the water's edge, we could see small fish in the clear water. After traveling a few hours, I became quite tired and stopped to rest under a large tree growing on the edge of the riverbank. Looking in the clear water, to my surprise, a large fish swam near. Up went the shotgun, I aimed at his head and pulled the trigger. We dined on fresh salmon, probably carp, but we called it salmon and enjoyed a new menu that night and had fish left over for 2 other meals. What a contrast to water gravy. At about sundown that evening, still in the box canyon beside the river, Pa came driving up in his new buggy pulled by old Prince. We had not seen him for nearly a year. He camped with us overnight and took Mother and the 2 babies in his buggy back to Chandler, leaving us to follow by wagon. Plenty of water in the river enabled us to keep the wood fellies of the wagon wheels wet, in order to keep the iron tires on. We camped at the bottom of Fish Creek Hill that night. The next morning, pulling up the hill, we left the river and looking at the vast expanse of the beautiful Salt River Valley, stretching for miles as far as the eye could see to the south and west of us. I had used the last shell on the fish. There was no use walking anymore. The old wagon crept along at the foot of Superstition Mountain and gradually descended to the flat desert country, forested with saguaro, a new variety of cactus to us, palo verde trees, mesquite and catclaw growing in dry arroyos. The morning sunlight played a symphony of colors, light and shadows on the towering cliffs and crags of Superstition Mountain to our left. To our right, the tall transmission towers carrying electricity from the powerhouse that had looked so impressive to us when nearby, marched westward across the Great Valley, each becoming progressively shorter as they reached the vanishing point on the western horizon. The giant cactus stood as great statues, with arms extended at random, guarding the desert floor before us. In the far distance of perhaps 20 miles southward, we could see a freight train, the Arizona Eastern, crawling toward the valley's eastern rim to the magma copper mine of Superior. The steam locomotive's smoke plumed backward as the train moved forward. A sign on our right marked Gold Field announced an old abandoned mining operation, which some thought might have been associated with the lost Dutchman mine legends of the past century. Upon reaching what is now called Apache Junction, we left the main road that turned to our right toward Phoenix and took a dim, rough, crooked trail going straight ahead. After 2 more hours, a grouping of what looked like small buildings could be seen. Bouncing along over chuck holes, crawling in and out of gullies, the tiny buildings we had first seen in the distance became larger. The straight lines of newly turned earth stretching across the desert floor toward the distant village became a large canal carrying irrigation water toward an area which had looked like green postage stamps in straight rows made up the village. The tiny village became a modern town with straight graveled streets, and at its center a large imposing building of old Spanish design and a sign, Hotel San Marcos, was observed. A shopping mall, including post office and bus stop and stores, occupied a prominent location on Main Street. We had arrived in Chandler. On the outskirts of town, a few blocks east, stood a hay barn filled with baled hay, fenced from a 20-acre green alfalfa patch. This property Pa had rented, and it became our home for the next 12 months. Driving out to the little house, we found Mother and our 2 baby sisters. Mother had cleaned the house, which had not been occupied for some time, and had a fire going in the small wood stove. Being late afternoon, she had cleaned and prepared the coal oil lamp for use, and as soon as we arrived with the chuck box, a quick supper was prepared. Pa came in carrying a dozen eggs, a paper sack of oranges, and a pound of bacon he had bought in town. The team had been unharnessed, fed some hay, and left loose in the small fenced enclosure containing the house. Soon beds were laid out, and the reunited family reclined for a much-needed rest after a week of hard traveling. Next morning, looking out in the yard, to our amazement, we found old Fan dead. She was lying close to the house. Her tracks around the yard and house indicated she had been sick and had tried to get help. A partly filled tub of soapy water Mother had been using to clean with was emptied, indicating she must have had a fever. Tears came to my eyes. I could not choke back a cry when I discovered my dear old animal friend and companion since I had first begun to remember. Memories came to me of the many times while she was loose in the field. She never objected to my walking up to her to pat her flank, scratch her nose, put the big toe of my left bare foot in the dimple of her left knee joint, grab her mane, and throw my right leg over her back to a sitting position without difficulty. A kick of both bare heels set her off in a gallop. A slap of the open palm of my left hand on her neck turned her to the right, and a slap of my right palm to the left. No rope, bridle, nor saddle were needed. The last time I remembered riding her was during my 5th grade at Fairview. Fan was picking weeds near the schoolhouse. At recess, I mounted her and took off across broken ground, nearly on a high lope. She jumped a dry arroyo about 4 feet wide, and I tumbled off into the gully. She stopped dead on the other side. Turning around, she nuzzled me to see if I were hurt. Then, permitting me to remount, we galloped on. Now she was gone out of my life, but remained only in my memory. Dad and I buried her body on the rented farm. Each member of Pa's family learned to become self-supporting at an early age. Before we left Cactus, Frank, Ernest, and Edna seldom lived at home when Pa was around. Each took jobs in the Gila Valley as they could find them. If they were offered board and a bed, they took the job without much thought of monetary wages, hoping to work up to better pay. During school terms, cash was not expected for part-time work they were able to do. Sometimes they could find a second job paying a few dollars to keep them in the essentials as needed. One home they could depend upon to take them in was owned by a single-parent widow lady, Mrs. Ella Haywood, who lived in Thatcher. She had reared a fine family consisting of Neil, Ella, and Spencer, who had completed all schools in the Gila Valley and left home for advanced professional training. Her youngest son, Yates, was about my age. Mrs. Haywood was a well-trained teacher. She was a sincere believer that each child should have a good education and a chance to develop any talents he might have. She preached that an idle mind was the devil's workshop and stressed the importance of putting time to good use. Each of her children was on a strict schedule both at school and at home. She owned a few acres that were intensely cultivated to produce fruit, vegetables, along with cows, pigs, and chickens to provide their food. Each child had his own chores to be responsible for, both summer and winter. Time was strictly scheduled for homework and study. A time was set aside for music. All the children had shown some interest and proficiency in art, and the practice hour was never neglected. Velma became an accomplished violinist and gave lessons on the instrument. Sister Haywood, as my mother called her, was a model my mother admired and tried to follow her example in raising her own family. This fine woman had a brother, Evans Coleman, who owned a small farm near Thatcher. Evans often needed to hire help in putting up hay or in irrigating. He would hire Ella's kids or anyone living with her family who wished to work. He paid about $2 per day for his help. These two families worked together, supplementing each other's needs and looking after their mutual interests. Frank, Ernest, and Edna, each at one time or another, had lived at the Haywoods for short periods while attending school in Thatcher. Uncle Adam and Aunt Ina Brewer assisted us in every way they could. Aunt Ina took Edna via horse and buggy to Mesa to find a job there. They found our old family friend Mrs. Haywood, who had lived in Thatcher until her family married and moved to the Salt River Valley. She had recently sold her home and bought a new one in Mesa to be near her children. She lived alone and in her advanced age needed help, but was unable to pay wages. She offered Edna a home until she could find a better job. This was accepted, and Edna lived with her for several weeks until she obtained a position as assistant housekeeper on the Tremaine Ranch School for Boys. There she earned her board and room with a fair salary, which she saved to continue her education at Flagstaff Teachers College, which she entered in the fall semester in 1915. Of course, Ernest remained on his summer vacation job as ranch foreman with the Chandler Improvement Company, where he earned his board and keep with some salary, then returned for the semester at Tempe Teachers College into his part-time school job with the Arizona Commission of Agriculture. Frank took the first farm job he could find until he later obtained a job with the Salt River Valley Water Users Association as a Sanjero in Glendale. Tillis was hired by Seymour Allen on his hay and dairy farm in the Chandler area. Aunt Ina took me and some other kids to pick figs from trees that grew on ditch banks near the town. No one seemed to know who planted them, but the fruit seemed to belong to anyone who would pick it. This was in the days when women wore big hats with a huge ostrich plume, scented with "Come Hither" perfume, that tickled her suitor's nose as it waved in the soft breezes of the Arizona desert. Mr. Chandler must have envisioned the prospects for billions by supplying her tools for romance, but failed to take into account the fickleness of women. At any rate, he had bought up 1,000 acres of raw desert land to be irrigated by the new SRV project, spent millions on improvements, and planted many acres to alfalfa hay to feed about 500 ostriches he imported from Africa. These large, ungainly birds found their new home of Valhalla, picking lush, nutritious alfalfa without restraint. They multiplied profusely. At last, like so many visions of elusive Dame Fortune fading, the woman had changed her mind. She no longer wore big hats but preferred to show her golden locks rather than plumes. Now we have produced the product in abundance. Where is the market? A ravenous consumer of expensive hay, The great bird hatched from 15 to 20 eggs each setting, which the female bird laid and the male incubated. Trying to recoup something from his investments, he had some of the huge eggs blown hollow and sold them for curio value. My first job in Chandler was blowing these eggs. Most of them were rotten and, of course, quite smelly. To blow an egg, a small hole was drilled in each end, then water under pressure was run through them until the shell's contents was cleaned out. This job paid only 5 cents per egg, so of course I did not get very rich. An experience I had with an old male ostrich one day goes like this. I was driving a pony for a hay stacking operation in a hayfield in which the old bullbird ran loose. He seemed to be having fun running the derrick horse boy up the stack to keep him away from me. I had seen my employer, Seymour Allen, ride a horse and with a black snake whip run the bird out of the field. Thinking this would be a good way to get rid of my pest, I tried it. Seeing me coming, the big bird stood his ground, and when I cracked the whiplash around his neck, he charged and jumped on the pony's back and knocked him down. Before he hit the pony, I slid off to one side and climbed the haystack while he was busy with the pony. I never tried that again. Soon after arriving in Chandler, we began attending the Mormon church, which was held in a large, portable, prefabricated frame building erected on a lot by bolting parts together. The bishop of the ward, Chester Peterson, was also one of the town's most popular lawyers. He was a large but trim young man who treated everyone with respect and friendly consideration. His oldest son, Elmer, my age, encouraged by his parents, invited me to participate in their family affairs quite often. He soon became one of my best friends. One of the bishop's hobbies was picnicking on the desert and shooting doves that flew over in great numbers during the evening hours. The bishop was a crack shot who rarely missed his winged targets. Elmer and I retrieved the birds that fell, and his mother made them up into bird pies. The Petersons owned a lovely home and a new car. They were considerate and hospitable with each other and made their guests feel at home. Mr. Peterson, a native of Utah, had received his legal training at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. He seemed to go out of his way to be nice to me and talk to me as if I were an equal person. This was a new experience for me because my own father's method of talking to his boys was the opposite, as if we were on a much lower plane and he needed to keep it that way to maintain his parental authority and discipline. Crowded in a 3-room shack, Taylor and I slept on cots outside or in the hay barn nearby. We usually had access to the daily newspaper, the Arizona Republic. I made a practice of stealing it out to the barn where I could be alone to keep up with the news. World War I had begun in Belgium and had spread to other countries in Western Europe. Both France and England were becoming involved. In the state and local news, an effort was being made by the new state educational department to reorganize the system, or lack of system, that had existed in the territorial government. One issue that faced the planning board was, should curriculums be built on scientific theories or biblical fundamentals and prophecy? The U.S. Constitution plainly states that it protects freedom of religion, but it also implies there shall be a division between church and state, and that no tax revenue shall be spent for religious purpose. Realizing our forefathers, who established our federal government, foresaw the wisdom of separating church and state, I believe them to be right in this opinion. As I in my young life had never been tempted to use alcoholic beverages, nor had I formed an opinion on the need for women's rights, I became interested in the religious argument which was being waged between the two factions with gusto. These were the days of the great moralists, William Jennings Bryan, Billy Sunday, and Carrie Nation, who were great advocates of prohibition and women's rights. Winkleman. When school started, I was enrolled in the 7th grade. My teacher's name was Miss Newton, a pleasant young woman from Nebraska. Baseball and basketball were the popular outdoor sport. I entered them both and enjoyed the school year in Chandler without any special problems. Dad had been gone about 8 months. We did not know where he was, but by the last of May, 1915, Mother received a letter from Winkleman. He explained he was in the fruit and produce business. He sent her train fare for herself, 2 babies and me, and asked her to come. We left by train, and upon arriving in Winkleman, found Pa had rented a large but unfurnished building from a widow lady, mother of 3 boys, William, Arthur, and Klein, ranging in age from about 16 to 18 to 20. She, with the help of her three sons, had planned, mixed, and poured by hand this large cement building. It made me think of the story, Widow O'Callahan and Boys. They were all fine people and became our good friends. Winkleman, located on the bank of the Gila River, was a recreation center for mine and smelter workers in Hayden, located about a mile over the hill by trail from Winkleman. After an amendment had been passed to the state constitution, outlawing the sale of liquor in open saloons, 17 saloons and gambling houses were closed. They were all boarded up and vacated at that time. The brothel business with a 6-foot board fence around it was left intact, however. Left in the town was a grocery store, a small bakery, ice plant, a small restaurant, and a drugstore. Many residents of Winkleman worked in mining or related operations in Ray and Hayden. Winkleman was located about 2 miles upstream from the influx of the San Pedro River, flowing north from the Huachuca mountain range. The town had no crossing except a cable car mounted on a 1-inch cable, anchored on the north Winkleman side to a steel anchor, buried in concrete, and on the south side to a large cottonwood tree. One desiring to cross the river could pull the car by standing in it and pulling on the big cable in the direction he wished to go. The town was served by a branch line called Arizona Eastern, branching from the Southern Pacific Main Line near Phoenix. It hauled mining supplies to operations at Ray, Hayden, and to a small town named Christmas, east of Winkleman. This was the summer of 1915. World War I had been going for more than a full year, and President Wilson had finished his first year in office. As soon as we were settled in part of the building, the market in the other part, Mother tending the store, I began looking for something I could do to make a little money. A young boy about my age had contracts for selling the El Paso Herald in the Arizona Republic. I applied for a franchise to sell the Arizona Gazette, an evening paper, and the Curtis publication, Saturday Evening Post, and Ladies' Home Journal. My magazines did not sell well because men were not interested and most women did not have the money. I made trip after trip hiking the trail over the hill to meet the 5 o'clock smelter shift change without selling a single paper. But my perseverance finally began to pay an occasional nickel or dime as workers noticed me day after day patiently soliciting sales at the same place. One thing that finally attracted a buyer of the Saturday Evening Post was when its publisher began to use Norman Rockwell's true-to-life paintings on its cover. The pictures sold the magazine. As time went on, the pictures became so prized the demand was difficult to supply. The Gazette was never popular. In September, school opened with a new principal teacher, a young man, Mr. John R. Spikes, a recent graduate from Tempe Normal School, who had been one of their popular athletes in baseball and basketball. I was enrolled in the 8th grade, but was deficient in mathematics. I found 2 good friends in Sexton Hyler, whose father operated a lumber yard, and Carol Butler, son of the depot agent. We 3 studied our lessons in the evenings, and with their help, I learned to extract the square root and square the circle. I enjoyed playing baseball and was complimented on my fastball as a pitcher. Mr. Spikes taught me to throw curves and drops. Soon after school opened, Paul left his family again. This time he was gone for 3 years without contacts. About Christmas time, Tillis came down from Flagstaff and obtained a job as a brakeman at the smelter slag dump. In February 1916, we had a big rain that lasted for about 6 weeks. Prior to the rain, the state had started to build a bridge across the river, about where the cable car was located. The heavy rains caused a terrible flood, and a pile driver and other power machinery on the job site were lost. The flood washed away most of the houses located on low ground, and it dislocated and swept away most of the prostitution center. The big tree that supported the cable car went down, and most of the bridge building equipment was lost, and several people were drowned. Glendale. In March, soon after the big flood, Mother contacted Frank in Glendale and explained our situation. He sent money to help pay our debts and for train fare. We then moved to Glendale. When we arrived, we found he had rented a 40-acre farm and had bought on credit about 60 head of cull dairy cows. The farm was located 3 miles east of Glendale on Lateral 18. There was a fair house on the property which we called home for the next 2 years. Out of the 60 cows, we 3 brothers hand milked about 40 head twice daily. Milking started about 5 o'clock each morning and it lasted until 7:30. Separating by hand crank separator an hour, cleaning up, feeding calves and pigs another hour. A trip to the creamery with a 10-gallon cream can tied in back of the buggy put us in town by 10:30 each morning. Then we did a repeat performance in the evening from 6 to 11 p.m. This worked quite well until school started, but as my algebra class was scheduled for 9 a.m., I didn't learn much about the subject. I did not have time to do much socializing, but made up by doing a lot of daydreaming while working. Somehow we got through that year. All things must end, even the most tedious. So a new year may begin. The new year in this event occurred in April of 1917. The school term had ended, and Frank received a notice from the farm owner to move, as we had been unable to pay the rent. What would we do with the cows? That was the question. Frank tried to get Mr. Hamill, from whom he had bought them, to take them back, but he refused, insisting he must have the cash, which of course was impossible. After pondering for a few days, Frank set out to find another place. Gilbert. He finally made a deal with Mr. Toggery Johnson, owner of a clothing store in Mesa named the Toggery. Mr. Johnson owned a small ranch near Gilbert, which was unfenced and undeveloped, and no crops had been grown. It had a small 3-room shack, totally unsuited for habitation. But we made do. We had a poor team, an old hay wagon and an old walking plow, nothing else to work with. The cows were poor, most of them being dry and a few had died. Frank was 30, single, and a prime target of the draft board, who were picking up young able-bodied men as fast as they could to be processed for training. Tyler, 19, was also on the list in reserve for a call within the year, depending on mobilization and processing. I would be 16 in September. At this time, service mobilization was set for all men between 18 and 45 to be called for physical examination. Single men were to be called first. After a family discussion of what would be best to do, it was decided to move the cows to the Johnson place near Gilbert. There seemed no other option, as we were under pressure to vacate the farm we were on. By daybreak, we 3 brothers, on foot, had the cattle moving southward on lateral 18 up Grant Avenue, across the railroad tracks. We found some unfenced brush land, and we moved slowly, allowing them to browse along the way until we reached the river about sundown. Here we found the ground encrusted with salt, as if covered with snow. We went up the river to find a favorable crossing where there was no brush or other growth on the riverbanks, save an occasional palm tree, most of which were dead. By dusk, we crossed down the river from Tempe. The cows were hungry and restless and refused to bed down. We spent most of the night on our feet, keeping them from wandering. By daylight, we were moving south to baseline. Not much of a road, just a dim trail going eastward. We followed it slowly, allowing the cattle to set the pace. By 2 p.m., we arrived at the Johnson place. Both we and the herd were so exhausted there was little movement for the next day or two. As there were no fences or corrals to contain the animals and no feed to hold them together, it fell to me to keep them together and off other farms along the roads. Frank and Tyler went back to move the family. While they were gone, I was alone and responsible for the hungry cattle. I had a little buckskin mare to ride, and she was an obstinate animal. She always wanted to go in the opposite direction and set her own gait, which was most often contrary to how I needed her to go. For this reason, I carried a board to regulate her speed and direction. To counter my method of control, she pitched me off and deliberately turned around and stepped on my rib cage with her front foot, breaking my ribs, leaving me with a permanent depression. I passed out, then regained consciousness with an excruciating pain that put an end to my cowboying. There was no food in the shack except a couple of potatoes, a batch of pinto beans, and a half-pound of coffee that was left over by Frank and Tillis, who had done some fence mending on the place the week before. I boiled the potatoes, beans, and coffee. When the potatoes and beans were eaten, I had nothing left but coffee, which was consumed on an empty stomach to the extent it made me allergic to the drink to this day. The evening of the 3rd day of their departure, Tillis returned with the hay wagon, bringing Mother, our 2 little sisters, and our belongings. Frank stayed in town looking for a buyer for the cattle. He returned the day with a buyer who offered 5 cents per pound. The herd was sold and money given to Mr. Hamill, who was not pleased with the sale and threatened Frank with a lawsuit. But as his draft papers were being processed, did not press the issue. A few days later, in response to his call, Frank took his physical and was sent to Camp Cody, New Mexico for training. Tyler and I, after filling a contract of hauling and loading a railroad boxcar with hay, moved the family back to Glendale, where we found temporary jobs. Tyler with Crystal Ice and I icing refrigerator cars in preparation for shipping cantaloupes during the season. Mesa. At that time, both our jobs terminated. After discussing our next move with Mother, it was decided that Tillis should go to Flagstaff to enter college, where Edna expected to finish her training the following spring. Fall was approaching, and a new semester would begin about the 1st of September, so Tylis left for Flagstaff. As there seemed no other option, Mother, the two little girls, and I went to Mesa. Uncle Adam was still working for SRVWUA, but due to an old job accident, had broken his leg and injured his hip joint, rendering him handicapped in walking. He had been transferred to a job caring for water regulations at the division gates, located northeast of Mesa. This job required a minimum of walking, and it furnished him a large 8-room company-owned house for his family to live in. As he and Aunt Ina had only 2 small boys, their housing was more than adequate. He obtained permission for Pa's family to move in. As many able-bodied men were being taken for the war effort, a manpower shortage had developed, and Uncle Adam was able to get me, a 16-year-old boy, into a man-sized job to be guided by his own supervision. I was hired as a Sanjaro, water boss, and assigned to manage Mesa District Number 1. This included tow laterals running parallel about 3 miles from the division gates southward to the baseline. The main ditch ran down what was known at that time as the Mill Road, but later called Mesa Drive. The other ditch paralleled it about 1 mile west. I obtained a bicycle for transportation. The new job paid a big $100 per month. I thought I had struck it rich. My job also included the operation of a big electric-powered pump called the McQueen Well, which supplemented the gravity water when needed. This big well had been developed by a farmer after whom the well got its name. It was used before the Salt River Project began to deliver water. It was hand-dug, about 7 feet in diameter, concrete-lined, with a steel laded leading from the surface to a platform where a large 50-horsepower electric motor that powered the pump located in the deep pit below. Heavy bare grid wires carried high-voltage power to a makeshift switch that had to be operated with a stick to turn the power on or off, at which event the power would arc with a flash that lighted up the black pit so one could see the water about 60 feet below the platform. It was obvious that a slip or an awkward step could throw a body into the electric grid, become electrocuted, and pitch to the bottom of the well. I viewed this task with considerable apprehension and dread each time I had to climb down the ladder to start or stop the pump. Other duties were to become acquainted with the farmers in my division and keep informed of their water needs and keep the farmer posted concerning the available water in the lateral that served his farm. Take orders for water from the farmer and tell him the day and hour he could take it. Learn to read water gauges so that full standard streams would be delivered. Keep a daybook journal to record all deliveries and report same to the accounting office at the end of each week so that billing could be done at the end of each month. Be courteous and helpful at all times to customers in serving their needs or desires. In theory, this seemed to be a bit incomprehensible. Suppose all farmers wanted water at the same time. What could be done? In practice, things worked out pretty well. Service was run on a turn system, for example. All farmers in the division were notified when water was being turned into the lateral that served their farm. Farmer A, whose farm was at the bottom of the lateral, was contacted. He had 10 acres of alfalfa. He ordered 8 hours of water. He is told it will be there at 6 a.m. on a certain day. All gates in the lateral are pulled. A standard 300-inch stream is turned into the lateral at 5 a.m. and arrives at 6 a.m. The next farm above him has 3 acres of melons. He is contacted and orders 2 hours of water and is told to put in his gate at 2 p.m. This system is repeated until all needs for water are filled. Occasionally, a farmer is not ready for his turn when he is notified, but would like to take it the next day. He says he wants 10 hours. In that event, if arrangements cannot be made for him to wait for his next turn, an additional stream may be turned in the lateral and measured at his head gate and turned off after the turn is completed and his head gate removed. The Sanjaro's job is continuous and never-ending. He may sleep when he has time and usually eats on the run. My transportation was a new bicycle. There was no paved roads in those days, not even uptown on Main Street in Mesa. It was also before relief. One ate sometimes if he worked, but if he did not work, he likely missed a few meals. Obesity was a rare disease in the lower classes of society. My sister Eva became school-age that fall, and I bought her a brand new blue bicycle. This was before school buses also. War news at this time informed us that the Germans, in their desperation, were using poison gases and were even experimenting with deadly virus diseases known as the Spanish influenza. People were warned to be vaccinated against the disease. People were dying in large numbers in Europe, and it was believed it had spread to the United States. We were notified by the officials of SRVWUA that vaccine was available and urged all employees and families of the organization to come in and be vaccinated. We all went, but came down with the flu anyway, a month or two later. We were all very sick, but managed to pull through. Many people we knew, however, were victims of the new bug. Uncle Adam had begun to show his age by this time. His broken leg had become quite painful, causing him to limp severely when he walked. He had become quite heavy due to such sedentary habits. Both Uncle Adam and Aunt Ina were very good to us. Their two boys, Leslie and Lyle, were about 10 and 5 years old. They often went out wool hunting, gathering wool off barbed wire fences left by sheep bands that left it while crawling under fences. As Uncle Adam's work duties did not require much of his time, he and Mother cleaned, corded, and spun the wool. Then the yarn was knitted into sweaters, foot comforts, and hoods. Aunt Ina was always full of verve and was the life of the party. Ernest, who had been in training in Washington State, had been sent to Europe and spent most of the winter in the Paris area. But being a second lieutenant, was kept in administrative duties and never experienced any frontline combat operations. Frank, sent over later than Ernest, arrived too late for combat, but was retained as a POW guard in West Germany for about 1 year after the armistice. Tila spent the winter of 1917 in Tucson and was used as a male nurse during the flu epidemic. Edna was in Flagstaff and finished her teacher's course by June of 1918. Mother filed for a divorce and obtained a court order giving her possession of a building lot Pa had bought in Chandler. Also, she obtained a court order for Pa to sell the old cactus home for what the property would bring and turn the proceeds over to Mother. With the money she received for the lot in Chandler, she bought an acre lot in Evergreen Acres, a new subdivision north of Mesa near the cemetery. This lot had a small shack on it, and with the spare time I had, I did all I could to improve it. I dug a cesspool and installed indoor bathroom facilities, put on a new roof, and built an extra room or two. When Mother received the proceeds from the sale of the cactus property, something like $800, she put $100 first payment on a new Model T Ford touring car, total cost of $800. This she turned over to me to do my work with instead of the bicycle. This arrangement did not last long because I got fired from my job soon after as the result of a dispute over a water turn between Donald McQueen and J.W. LeSueur. McQueen was watering with a pump head of water, and LeSueur was using a gravity flow. A big thunderstorm came up and lightning struck the power line and stopped the pump. McQueen put his head gate in and took J.W. LeSueur's water. I took LeSueur's part and McQueen got me fired. Tyler had been released by this time and came to Mesa. We both soon got jobs working for Billy Riggs Transfer Company. This lasted until the fall of 1918, when Ernest came home soon after Armistice Day, November 1918. He immediately went back to his old job with the Arizona Commission of Agriculture and Horticulture. He then rented a little cottage in the 1700 block on West Washington Street, quite close to the Capitol building. Edna had been home since her graduation at the State Normal School in Flagstaff and had obtained a teacher's contract to the Liberty School District, a short distance in West Phoenix. Ernest invited Edna, Tillis, and me to come live with him. Edna continued her teaching. Tillis and I enrolled in the Lamson's Business College. I took bookkeeping, typing, business English, and business law. The school occupied the upper floor of the Crest building, located about the middle of the block on West Washington, just off Central Avenue. Utilis and I enrolled about the middle of December 1918 and did the janitor work and payment of our tuition. About the 1st of May 1919, it was determined I had attained enough skill in typing to hold down a job and was referred to the R.G. Dunn Mercantile Agency, located on the third floor of the Hotel Jefferson building, tallest building in Phoenix at that time. My job was typing up credit reports from handwritten reports written by credit investigators. My boss was Mr. D.M. Dillon, a little bombastic Irishman. When I took the job, I explained that I would be going back to college in the fall. I had determined to become a lawyer and had planned to take my training at the University of Utah, as my old friend Bishop Chester Peterson had done. I found my new job quite interesting, as it gave me information on about every business in town. At home, Edna had renewed acquaintance with an old boyfriend, Leslie Peel. They had gone with each other in Chandler. Ernest was courting Ethel Stewart in Mesa, Salt Lake City. After a long, hot, uneventful summer, I had saved train fare to Salt Lake City. I bid goodbye to Mr. Dillon and thanked him for the job. He grasped my hand and bid me goodbye and good luck. I had nearly reached my 18th birthday and was anxious to get away on my own. Packing a small bag, I boarded the train one evening and arrived in Salt Lake City about dark the next evening. I knew no one nor anything about the city, but found a cheap room nearby to spend the night. The next morning, after eating a light breakfast, I was eager to see the university and the city. On inquiry, I was told the school was at the end of East South, about a mile east of South Temple, and that a trolley line ran to the front gate. But school was closed for a 2-week break between quarter sessions. The new session would begin the 1st of September. I also learned the college operated on the quarter system rather than by 2 semesters with a full summer break. As I only had a few dollars left after my train fare, I began to hunt for a job. I soon found out there were many hundreds of other young men recently discharged from service, all of whom had veterans' preference to what few jobs there were. I also discovered the federal government had set up a makeshift U.S. employment service, employing 2 people, a man, Robert Wilson, and a woman to answer the telephone. This was set up in a feeble effort to find jobs for the veterans. Mr. Wilson was a large red-headed Texan who smoked big cigars and rode a motorcycle with a sidecar. He seemed interested in my case but had no job to offer. He did have a spare bedroom in his home he let me use until I could find a job. For this I became greatly indebted. His wife was a motherly old lady from Dedalia, Missouri. She was very kind and considerate and treated me as if I were her own son. Sunday came around and I attended church. There I met a young woman about my age who kept books for the Jensen Creamery. I told her I had taken a bookkeeping course, and she arranged with her boss to have me help her a couple of days in sending out statements to accounts receivable at the end of the month. For this, they paid me about $3. I lived on peanuts for the 2 weeks before school started. I worked steadily searching for work, but all my contacts were without success. In my search, I became well acquainted with all the streets and points of interest in the city. Hardly a day passed that I failed to hike out to the university, hoping I might catch someone in the university to talk with. But it seemed all my efforts were of no avail. At last, on the Saturday evening, before registering, was to start the following Monday morning, after I had given up all hope of finding work, I went out in the evening to take my last view of the beautiful valley from its eastern rim. I sat on the green grass of the campus. A thought then crossed my mind as if someone had said, "Why don't you pray?" A calmness settled over me, and I poured out my heart's desire to the Lord. A few minutes later, as the evening shadows seemed to increase, I observed an old gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, approaching me. He sat down beside me and asked my name and what I was doing. In reply to my answer, he pulled a pen and notebook from his pocket, wrote a note, and handed it to me with a verbal instruction to take the note to Mr. Shea, owner of Shea's Cafeteria, about 310 South Temple, which was a basement location. A few minutes later, he left as I awkwardly muttered my thanks in token of my appreciation. I lost no time in delivering the message and was put to work as busboy in one of the finest eating places in the city. My new employer led me to a cot in the service room. After a few hours' work and a good meal, I slept soundly with a prayer of thankfulness in my heart to the Lord for his kindness and blessings. The following Monday morning, I was at the college being counseled for entrance in pre-legal training. My schedule was Latin, sociology, English 1, and psychology. The first quarter ended the last of December. I received good grades in all my subjects. Mr. Shea was very good to me. He assisted in advancing money to buy my books and in paying for other school requirements. He had a lovely home, a beautiful wife, and a little daughter about 2 years old. He sometimes took me to church with him. He belonged to the Christian Science denomination. I worked full-time in the cafeteria during the 2 weeks break, ending on January 1st, and paid back the money he had loaned me. During the break, a young man, Jay Smith, came to work as a busboy and worked along with me. He was a nice boy, about 2 years younger than I, and we became good friends. And the Sunday when the cafeteria was closed, he took me to see his mother and sister. They were from Iowa and lived in a small rented apartment. Mrs. Smith was nice to me and invited me to have lunch with them. After lunch, I joined them in an afternoon hike in the hills. It was their custom to backpack. They took food along that could be roasted over hot coals of a campfire and eaten as a snack before bedtime. We had a very pleasant afternoon and looked forward to other trips in the beautiful hills and mountains that surrounded the picturesque city. Mrs. Smith, Ruby, was a small, nice-looking woman who had been widowed soon after her second child, Sylvia, was born. Sylvia was about 14 at the time. They lived on a small annuity, probably insurance-related. But Mrs. Smith did housework for others part-time to supplement their income when work was available. The beginning of the new quarter occurred January 2nd, 1920. My course of study consisted of Latin 2, English 2, Economics, and American History 1. I continued to live in the service quarters of the cafeteria, where I monitored the furnace and water conditioning equipment. Jay and I continued working as busboys before and after school hours. About the last of February, I came down with a bad case of the measles. Mr. Shea moved me from my quarters to the basement of his home. I shared the basement with his big police dog while the epidemic lasted. I was real sick for a few days, but quickly recovered after the high fever broke. When the quarantine was lifted, Mr. Shea had made arrangements for me to work for a friend, Mr. W.T. Gregory, who owned a small grocery store on the east side of the city. Mr. Gregory's store had very few drop-in customers. He operated by telephone orders each morning, writing up each order for the day. I picked up the written orders as he obtained them, sacked or boxed the order, and by noon, when his calls were all made, the merchandise was packaged and made ready for delivery. He tended the store while I loaded and delivered each order in his Model T Ford pickup. This took from 2 to 3 hours each day. Mr. Gregory paid me well, so I was able to pay for my board and room in Mrs. Wilson's home, the old lady who first took me in when I arrived in the city. Oddly, all three of my benefactors, Wilson, Shea, and Gregory, were members of the Christian Science Church. They were also very fine people. At the end of the second quarter, about the 20th of March, I had finished with good grades. In fact, I, with one or two others in the economics class, were excused of taking the final examination. During these 2 quarters, I had earned 24 college credits. I worked full-time for Mr. Gregory during this break, then dropped back to the part-time schedule when the next quarter began, the 1st of April. I enjoyed working at the grocery store. It seemed there was more freedom than in the cafeteria. Mr. Gregory was very good to me, and our relations were almost ideal. Registration for the 3rd quarter included a continuation of Latin and the English languages, political science, and continued American history. The basics totaled 12 credits plus 2 units of a physical training course, wrestling and judo. Wrestling, a body-to-body contact sport unlike boxing and judo, is a rough but not so brutal a sport as boxing, since the savage chokehold had been barred. Historically, it was in a stadium where the tyrants of ancient Greece amused themselves by watching their vassals kill each other in mock battle between victor and vanquished. Not having the courage to personally lead their subjects in battles, they humored themselves, became fat, and ordered their subjects to kill themselves and each other, while they viewed the contest in comfort and imagined themselves as the victor. Judo, a sister sport to wrestling, originated in the Orient. Boxing, limiting the violence to the use of the fists, has its roots from all nations, but has been refined and promoted in the United States and ballooned to the stance of big business. All aerobic sports, if participation is within reason, is of course beneficial to health and general welfare. I, having strengthened my grip by hand, milking about 15 cows twice each day for 2 years, and my leg muscles by riding a bicycle almost constantly on rough ground for a year, decided to keep trim by enrolling in wrestling. At that time, there were about a dozen Japanese boys at the university. They had organized a class in judo that met at the same time in an adjoining room to the class I took in wrestling. They welcomed my joining them at my pleasure. So I took some lessons from them, but claimed no laurels for my efforts. My friends and classmates soon learned to respect my hand grip and jokingly dubbed me the plumber, stating if I decided to go into the plumbing business, I would not need to buy any pipe wrenches. I did so well in this class, I was chosen to represent the university in the collegiate intramural contests. I spent considerable time and thought to making ready for the occasion and visited my Japanese friends to learn a few tricks that might prove helpful. This proved to be my undoing. I sprained my ankle that had been crushed by the gears of a horsepower unit that powered the operation of a well drilling machine when playing with other kids in my first grade. The ankle swelled and became feverish and so painful I could hardly walk when the athletic event occurred. My work at the grocery store kept me so busy I had little time for anything else. But I occasionally saw Jay at the cafeteria, and we four took hiking trips into the hills on Sundays. The fourth quarter began the 1st of June, and subsequent studies for the next 2 quarters ending in March of 1921 were rather intensive studies in language, word meaning and building from their Latin and Greek derivatives into the modern English words, etymology, philosophy, history, both ancient and modern American, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution. The lives and contributions of the early patriots of our great nation were intensively studied during this period. My grades were above average, but I had grown up with an inferiority complex. I could not visualize myself standing on my feet before a court of law arguing a case. As a child, I was brought up to believe a child should be seen and not heard. I have always known I have been my worst critic and that this problem is a condition that can be overcome. But there have been many times when I've tried to express my thoughts in public, and a mental block has embarrassed me for weeks after. Of course, thinking of these things in my later years, I realize such circumstances are experienced by everyone in a lifetime and are of little importance compared with other problems. I was too shy to seek help. I signed up for a course in public speaking, but could not stand the pressure and dropped it after attending a few classes. I was given a pantomime assignment in which my antics must have been a tremendous success, as it brought a roar of laughter, but I could not see the funny side. I had gone through a period of mental torture. Word from home revealed that Frank had returned from Europe and married Julia Fish, a girl from Lakeside that Aunt Alice had referred him to, on the 14th of December, 1919. Ernest and Ethel Stewart had married June 1st, 1920, and Edna and Leslie Peel had married June 11th, 1920. By August 1921, I had completed 8 quarters and earned 66 credit hours of the 124 needed for an AB. I had satisfied all requirements for entering the study of law, except for the 3 credit course in public speaking I had dropped. I simply could not face the thought of retaking this course. Latest word from Mother informed me that she and our little sisters were living in Los Angeles with Edna, who was expecting a baby. Mother was having a hard time supporting herself and the little ones. Leslie was working as a truck driver, gathering milk from farms, and small dairies hauling it to the processing plants. The heavy lifting required had caused an abdominal hernia, resulting in severe pain and discomfort. After reading Mother's sad letter and mulling over my own self-disappointment and failure to succeed in my ambition to become a lawyer, I finally decided I should leave Salt Lake and try to finish my education closer to home, where I could be near my family. I had not yet decided on what career I should pursue, but I was determined to continue my education. Ruby Smith. I was so depressed over my dilemma of what I should do, I felt I must talk with someone. I mentioned it to Mrs. Smith, whom I called Mother, because she was twice my age. She thought it would be fun to hitchhike to Los Angeles. I had no money and had thought of hiking the long distance alone, and welcomed the thought of having the company of her and her 2 children, who were my friends. At any rate, the planned date of departure arrived, and we were on our way toward Los Angeles over the Arrowhead Trail with our backpacks and blankets. The first day we arrived in Provo. Darkness set in, and we found a secluded spot beside the road, toasted a hot dog by a campfire, used the blanket each carried, and made ourselves a bed. Finally, day broke, and we were on the road early next morning, none the worse for the experience of sleeping at the side of the road. Next day, we were lucky. A man driving his car picked us up and hauled us to St. George and parked at a service station. When I returned from the restroom, Ruby was alone. She explained that a couple had stopped for a moment who were headed for Los Angeles, and they had room for a couple of people and had taken Jay and Sylvia with them. No one will ever know how depressed and lonely I was at this time. I had gone through so much to get a lawyer's degree at the University of Utah, and I had come so close to my goal, only to lose the opportunity because of my inferiority complex and shyness. It seemed that everything and everyone was against me. Through the past 2 years, Mrs. Smith and I had become the best of friends, and we enjoyed each other very much. I suppose it was inevitable that what happened next would come about. The next morning, we continued our journey and made Las Vegas about 2 p.m. After we were there for a few hours, we decided to get married, knowing that our families would really be upset. But we did anyway, because both of us were so lonely. So upon inquiry, we found a Mormon bishop who performed the ceremony, and he gave her a certificate of marriage which she carried in her backpack. Neither of us had any money, but she thought we should hurry to Los Angeles. So she wired Collect, a relative living in Iowa, for money. An hour or two later, we were riding a train and arrived before dark at the home of my sister Edna. It happened that Jay and Sylvia had found my folks and rented an apartment nearby, and upon hearing of our expected arrival, were at Edna's place when we came. While looking for something in her mother's pack, Sylvia found the marriage certificate. Looking at it, she cried, "Oh, Mama, what have you done?" The air suddenly turned blue with suspense. Our arrival met with a frigid reception, which compounded my feeling of guilt and froze my tongue so I couldn't speak. I went with my Smith family to their small apartment, and the next morning I went out looking for a job. I took the first job I found, working on a truck delivering heavy milk and cream cans to various processing companies in the city. Within a few days, I was hired by the Sam Selig grocery chain store, which was located nearby. My home relations were normal and quite happy, but I felt I had blown my opportunity to do the things in life I had dreamed of. I kept in touch with mother and sister. After about 3 weeks, a relative of Leslie's had come for a short visit. He planned to leave for Mesa and had agreed to take me with him, because by this time I knew that I had made a big mistake in marrying an older woman with 2 children, and I still had the desire to get my college degree. The time for his departure was relayed to me. He planned to leave at night to avoid the heat of the desert they would have to cross on the way. Instead of coming home that evening, I went with him to Mesa. By doing this, I added to the feeling of guilt I had on my conscience. Back to Arizona. Arriving in Mesa, I found my brother Frank was working as foreman in a concrete paving operation being done for the city of Mesa. He gave me a job, but he became so critical of my having married an older woman and then leaving her, I could not take it. I left at the end of a 2-week work schedule without picking up my paycheck, which was due. I boarded a freight train, cattle car in Tempe about dark that evening. A cold wind blew through the open spaces of the car. I arrived in Tucson about sunup next morning, chilled and hungry. I found a Chinese restaurant and offered to wash their dishes for a meal. It took the train all day to make up cars for the run eastward. By 9 o'clock that evening, it pulled out. A Mexican and I had found a warm place in the reefer of an empty refrigeration car. I had heard that my cousin, Fred Brewer, was working in the mine at Lowell, a suburb of Bisbee, and I planned to get off at Benson and catch another train on the Arizona Eastern Branch line that ran to Bisbee. Being tired from my trip the night before, I soon went to sleep, hoping to wake up when we arrived at Benson. When I awoke, it was about an hour before daylight. The train had stopped for a few minutes in Wilcox. I had overshot my mark about 50 miles. Crawling off, I hoped to catch a westbound to get back to Benson. About sunup, the train I hoped to ride arrived but did not stop. It was not moving more than about 15 miles per hour, however. I thought by waiting for the last car, I might catch it and climb on. As it passed, I made a dash for the handrail, but could not hang on. The momentum threw me down the rough grade on boulders and brush, where I laid for a few minutes to recover from the shock. Arising, I found I had some abrasions and torn clothing, but no serious injury. Walking down the track a few miles, I came to a section house, where maintenance workers lived. I was hungry and traded my fountain pen for some tortillas y frijoles, then continued my journey southward. The sun went down and darkness followed. The lights of Douglas were plainly visible across the flat level floor of the desert, but both Lowell and Bisbee, located in the mountains to my right, were obscured from vision. Near midnight, I observed the lights of a car bumping over the rough trail coming toward me. It was the first one of the day. I was about exhausted. It turned out to be a rancher on his way to work on the graveyard shift. He picked me up and hauled me in. After searching 2 or 3 gambling places, I found my cousin playing poker. On sight of me, he jumped up and extended his hand. It was a happy reunion after several years of being parted. We went to his apartment where he had a pot of beans cooked up. My, how good they tasted. Life as a miner. The next morning I was hired as a mucker, assistant to a miner. After being fitted with a hard hat, carbide lamp, and heavy shoes, the elevator took me down to the 1,000-foot level. There I was assigned to work with an old experienced miner, a refugee from Czechoslovakia, Mike Mijalovic. He was a tall, raw, muscular man who had worked as a slave in the mines in the Balkans before he migrated to America. He was a friendly person, and we became good partners. Mike and I had been assigned to clean up a dangerous large cavity in preparation for timbering. The ceiling was already about 10 feet high due to seepage of water. Large flakes of approximately a half-ton were frequently falling. We were cleaning the floor with picks and shovels, preparing footage for timbers. At the moment, we were working about 10 feet apart and stooped over. A big slab came down from the ceiling that landed between us. I was unscathed, but a fragment hit Mike on his hip, causing a bloody abrasion. Mike's injury was not serious, but the slab could have killed us both if we had been a couple of feet closer together. Before the accident, we had just finished barring down the ceiling, a precaution against overhead sloughing. The next shift I was sent to assist a Mexican miner, Frank Ortega, who was starting a raise from the 1,800-foot level, bottom drift of the mine, to the 1,700-foot level. This was the hottest place I had ever been in. Had it not been for the compressed air lines used for drilling, we would have suffocated. The formation we were working was black sulfide that painted us black in a few minutes. The day after we had blasted the night before, I was cleaning up, shoveling the mineralized ore in a car, and breaking big pieces with my pick. I raised the pick to find an unexploded stick of dynamite clinging to the point with an unexploded cap. My pick point had missed only by a couple of inches. University of Arizona. After about 3 months' work in the mine, I enrolled at the University of Arizona in Tucson in September. I found a job washing dishes and doing general kitchen KP in a tuberculosis sanitarium for my board and room. My hours and conditions were not favorable for study, so my grades were low. I took English literature, Chaucer, father of English poetry, and author of the Canterbury Tales in Spanish and psychology at a junior grade level. The next semester was a continuation of the first. I soon obtained a job as a waiter in the Varsity Inn, a popular restaurant outside of the campus gates. It was owned by Ice Adams. This job supplemented my sanitarium job and paid 25 cents per hour for my work, and I earned my meals. I worked at this during the lunch hour and sometimes on Saturdays. Mrs. Kurd, the German lady at the sanatorium for whom I washed dishes, still furnished me with bed and meals for my work on weekends and other times I could spare. At the inn, most of our customers were ex-servicemen with their government pensions, the affluent class who had money to pay their way, wear good, clean clothes and polished boots, shined by others. My, how I did envy them. They were noblemen and I was the serf. They studied at leisure. Sometimes I had no time to open a book. As a result, my grades suffered severely. During the last month of the second semester, I conceived an idea. The cost of textbooks was no small item in the expense of going to school. It took most of my saving left from the few dollars I could earn during vacation. No one sold used texts at the college. Contacting the manager of the bookstore, I arranged for the use of a small corner of the store, built a counter and some shelves. Borrowing a typewriter, I typed out a message. Notice, if you wish to sell your textbooks at the end of the semester, please follow these instructions. Lightly pencil the price you paid for your book on the upper left-hand corner of its flyleaf. Either come in and contact Fred Russell or be sure to leave your address. Books in good condition will be priced for resale at 80% of the new price. If this is not satisfactory, please come in and negotiate your price. You may pick up your money when books are sold. In the amount of the sale price, less 20% for handling. I was surprised at the response to this ad. Books piled up to a point I could scarcely handle the business as the semester came to an end. I stayed with the little business until the university closed for the summer vacation, then went to work in the Miami copper mine in Miami, Arizona. I found this a more dangerous place to work than in Lowell. The overburden created so much pressure, heavy timber was required to keep it from caving in. My job in this mine was a timber rustler working alone. Some of the drifts were blocked by broken timber. I found one specimen where an 8 by 10 inch by 6 feet long timber had settled from its 6-foot length to resemble a sponge about 3 feet long. One could hear timber popping and cracking constantly. I was glad to leave that job when summer vacation was over. I rode back to school with a friend and coworker on the back of his motorcycle over the newly opened but unpaved Superior Highway. The unpaved road was rocky and rough, and when we arrived at Mrs. Curd's sanatorium, I could hardly walk. I felt as if I had been pounded over the kidneys with a ball bat. This condition was extremely painful, but cleared up in a week or two. When school opened, I went back to my bookstore business and made so much money, I felt quite independent. But I was still plagued with guilt and an inferiority complex for being a married man and deserter. Within a week after classes, my business came to an end. But I obtained a job keeping Old Main clean, the oldest building on the campus, in which the bookstore was located. I continued to live and help out at the sanatorium. At the sanatorium, I met one of the guests that was in his late 40s by the name of John Scott Davidson, a New York lawyer who had made his fortune in the law business on Wall Street. He preferred to be called Jack by his friends. Jack, a talkative person, often engaged me in conversation. He called me Freddie and seemed to be attracted by my tendency to be self-conscious and shy. He spoke with a New York accent, using big words, and seemed to be a walking encyclopedia of knowledge and information. He smoked cigarettes and was liberal with passing them around, and seemed offended if friends did not indulge in the pastime. I soon became hooked on the weed, which lowered my self-respect several notches. Jack wore knickerbockers and blue stockings, and liked to accompany me when I went to my English literature class, taught by Dr. Patterson, one of the regents of the college. At first I felt flattered to be accompanied by one with so much intelligence, but soon noticed Jack's presence, uninvited in the class, was not appreciated by the doctor. I did my best to slip away, but Jack's ego and self-importance was difficult to evade. I sensed my popularity was fading by Jack's persistence in accompanying me to the classroom, and that the doctor felt I was to blame for my friend's imprudence. I finally decided to change my residence to the men's dormitory with the hope of evading him, but he continued to come as if he were enrolled as a member of the class. Dr. Patterson's office was located in Old Main, the building I had contracted to keep clean. This was my senior year, 1923. I should have graduated in the spring of 1924. Besides Dr. Patterson's English literature class, I had enrolled in Dr. Tucker's Shakespeare studies of Hamlet and Macbeth. I took Botany 1 and 2 first semester and Zoology 1 and 2 second semester. The teacher in my botany class was Dr. Caldwell. He was a precise old gentleman and had his students assigned to permanent seats alphabetically arranged. In calling the roll the first day, he called Reese, Lenore, then Russell, Fred. I looked to my right into the most beautiful blue eyes of the loveliest young woman I had ever seen. My heart did a double flip-flop. I was speechless. Her lovely eyes reflected my feelings. A side glance confirmed a patrician posture, crowned with immaculate golden hair and fair skin. There was the girl of my dreams beside me. Shyness and guilt compounded, and I dared not look again. In the year of 1924, after school was out, I failed to graduate from the University of Arizona. Had I been in the University of Utah, I would have graduated to my objective of becoming a lawyer, which was my great ambition. I had already completed pre-law subjects required. Belatedly, I had discovered the University of Arizona had no curriculum leading to professional training, other than one leading to becoming a teacher. The college had no student guidance officers to assist the students. This failure upset my plans to the point that I would have taken anything that would pay a few dollars. I returned to Mesa. Back to Mesa. Then Ernest, who had been working for the Commission of Agriculture and Horticulture, suggested that I apply for a job with that commission. At this time, a new crop, cotton, had been introduced into the valley. Along with the crop of cotton was the great fear that the cotton boll weevil would be introduced along with the cotton. Ernest suggested that I apply to Dr. Bartlett for a position as a field inspector. This position entailed the study of plant life by sweeping the fields with hand nets in search of insects that might carry the